Part VII, Chapter VII of the Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2, by Edward Tyas Cook. The Nurses' Battle and Health in the Village, 1885 to 1893. Nursing cannot be formulated like engineering. It cannot be numbered or registered like population. Florence Nightingale, 1890. What can be done for the health of the home without the woman of the home? In the West, as in the East, women are needed as rural health missioners. Florence Nightingale, 1893. The period of Miss Nightingale's life covered in this chapter includes the year of Queen Victoria's Jubilee, which was also what Miss Nightingale used to consider her Jubilee year. She fixed her effectual call at February 7, 1837. In 1887 she had thus completed 50 years vowed to service. In August, a month of many memories to her, she looked back over the past and around her in the present, and was in a despondent mood. Miss Nightingale to Mrs. S. Smith, Claydon House, August 5, 1887. Dearest Aunt Mai, thinking of you always, grieved for your suffering, hoping that you have still to enjoy. In this month, 34 years ago, you lodged me in Harley Street, August 12, and in this month, 31 years ago, you returned me to England from Scutari, August 7. And in this month, 30 years ago, the first Royal Commission was finished, August 7. And since then, 30 years of work, often cut to pieces but never destroyed. God bless you. In this month, 26 years ago, Sidney Herbert died after 5 years of work for us, August 2. In this month, 24 years ago, the work of the Second Royal Commission, India, was finished. And in this month, this year, it seems all to have to be done again. And in this month, this year, the work at St. Thomas's Hospital seems all to have to be done again, changing matrons after 27 years. And in this month, this year, my powers seem all to have failed, and old age set in. May the Father Almighty, irresistible, for love is irresistible, whose work and none other's this is, conduct it always as he has done while I have misconducted it. May he do in us what he would have us do. God bless you, dearest Aunt Mai, as ever your old loving Flo. And in this month, too, Florence Nightingale was to die, but nearly a quarter of a century of life was first granted to her, and for the greater part of the time she remained in full possession of her faculties. Though she might be an old lady to young nurses, others remarked that she looked wonderfully fresh and youthful for her years. If old age had set in, her powers had by no means failed, and in many directions her work, though sometimes sore beset, continued to prosper. We will take first in our survey her work in the nursing world. The change of matrons at St. Thomas's Hospital caused by the retirement of Mrs. Wardroper was hardly such a tragedy as it seemed to Miss Nightingale. Mrs. Wardroper had done her work, and there were younger women competent to fill the place. Mr. Jowett often begged Miss Nightingale to remember that there is no necessary man or woman, not even, as greatly daring, he once added, yourself. But in this case the chief of the Nightingale School was not yet retiring, and she would still be able to supervise it, perhaps even more closely under a new matron. For many years Miss Nightingale continued to maintain the intimate touch with her school that has been described in an earlier chapter, seeing the sisters constantly, making the personal acquaintance of nurses, conferring with their medical instructors, reading their diaries and examination papers. Her heart was even more closely in the work when she secured the appointment as Mrs. Wardroper's successor of her dear friend Miss Pringle. Presently, however, there came what was a heavy blow to Miss Nightingale. Miss Pringle joined the Roman Communion, and it was necessary that she should retire from the matronship of St. Thomas's. The months of unsettlement before the conversion was made were full of grief to Miss Nightingale. Indeed, her notes and meditations suggest that the loss of her favourite pupil was one of the heaviest griefs of her life. But she loved her friend too well for the sorrow to leave any abiding bitterness. Over and over again in her meditations she wrote down lines from Clough's Qua cursum ventus. Miss Pringle was succeeded by Miss Gordon, an old pupil of the Nightingale School. She and Miss Nightingale speedily became the best of friends, and things went on much as before in the school. All these changes, with the delicate weighing of rival claims and sometimes with the worrying conflict of personal ambitions, caused Miss Nightingale heavy anxiety. Intensely conscientious, acutely sensitive, and seeing in every change a great potentiality of good or evil, she could not treat such things as mere matters of business. There have been Prime Ministers who could not sleep of nights under the sense of responsibility caused by ecclesiastical preferment, and to Miss Nightingale the selection of a superintendent or a home sister was even as the appointment of a bishop. 2. The movement for district nursing, which was always near to Miss Nightingale's heart, and which, in conjunction with Mr. Rathbone and others, she had done much to promote, received considerable extension by the action of Queen Victoria in 1887. The bulk of the sum presented as the Women's Jubilee Gift was devoted by the Queen to the nursing the sick poor in their own homes by means of trained nurses. She appointed the Duke of Westminster, Sir Rutherford Alcock, and Sir James Paget to be trustees of the fund and to advise upon its administration. Sir James Paget consulted Miss Nightingale, who in several conversations impressed upon him her view that the essential things were the training of nurses for the work and the association of them in homes. The lines of the Metropolitan District Nursing Association, which had for many years been largely supported by nurses trained in the Nightingale School and by grants from the Nightingale Fund, were adopted as the basis of the Jubilee Institute for Nurses, and the association presently became affiliated to the Institute. In an introduction which she contributed in 1890 to a book giving account of these matters, Miss Nightingale struck a warning note. The tendency is now to make a formula of nursing, a sort of literary expression. Now, no living thing can less lend itself to a formula than nursing. Nursing has to nurse living bodies and spirits. It must be sympathetic. It cannot be tested by public examinations, though it may be tested by current supervision. The Royal Jubilee Institute in some ways advanced Miss Nightingale's cause, but she had misgivings. Vexilla regis prodeunt. Yes, but of which king? Was the oriflamme, which was now beginning to wave above the nursing sisterhood, of heavenly fire or of terrestrial tissue? "We are becoming the fashion," Miss Nightingale was fond of saying. "We must be on our guard. Royalty is smiling on us. We must have a care." Such misgivings were speedily to be justified. The nursing world was for some years rent in twain by a dispute about royal charters and registration. The controversy lasted for 7 years, 1886 to 93. Miss Nightingale was in the thick of it, and during the more critical period of the dispute, 1891 1892, it was her main public preoccupation. In 1886, the Hospitals Association appointed a committee to inquire into the possibility of establishing a general register of nurses. The committee violently disagreed. In 1887, the majority retired, and the minority founded the British Nurses Association with a view to carrying forward a scheme of registration. In 1888, the Hospitals Association appointed a second committee which proceeded to collect opinions from the various nurse training schools. These schools were, for the most part, opposed to the idea of a general register. But there was difference of opinion among leaders alike in the medical profession and in the nursing world. "I have a terror," wrote Miss Nightingale to Mr. Bonham Carter (April 20, 1889), "lest the B.N.A.'s and the anti-B.N.A.'s should form two hostile camps, judging one another by that test chiefly or alone. This would be disastrous. The Unionists and the Home Rulers show us an example of what this is. They are two hostile camps, dividing families. It is like a craze. The test, for example, even of a good doctor or of an acquaintance is, to which camp does he belong? Even a doctor canvassing for an appointment is asked whether he is Home Ruler or Unionist. I can remember nothing so distressing since the Reform Bill, which I remember very well, when the two sides would not meet each other at dinner. I do not know that feeling between the pro-registrationists and the anti-registrationists went to the length of war to the knife and fork, but the nurses' battle, as it was called in the newspapers, was hot and prolonged. From a fighting point of view, the two sides were fairly matched. On each side there were eminent doctors. The antis had an advantage in that they included the greater number of those who had the longest and closest knowledge of nurse training. But the pros had a princess at their head. The Princess Christian had accepted the presidency of the British Nurses Association, and when the time came for applying for a charter, it was the Princess who petitioned the Queen. "This makes it awkward for us," said Mr. Rathbone to Miss Nightingale, and undoubtedly it did. There were courtly personages even among Miss Nightingale's devoted adherents who were inclined to trim. And there were other persons who, having never perhaps thought out the questions, were predisposed to do as the Princess did. Let each man in the battle have such credit as is due for his personal loyalty. "In any matter of nursing, Miss Nightingale is my Pope," wrote Mr. Rathbone, "and I believe in her infallibility. Nothing can save us," he said to Miss Nightingale herself, "except your intervention." She was not slow to give it. Suggestions were made by intimate friends, Sir Henry Acland and Sir Harry Verney, that she should see the Princess Christian and endeavour to come to terms. And later on, in 1893, when the Empress Frederick visited Miss Nightingale, they renewed the suggestion. But the Princess Christian had made no overtures. She was committed to the particular scheme advocated by the association of which she was president, and to Miss Nightingale opposition to that scheme was a matter of vital principle. She threw herself into the fray with an equipment of argumentative resource derived from her unequalled experience, and with a passionate conviction inspired by long brooding over a fixed ideal. The objects of the British Nurses Association were to unite all qualified British nurses in membership of a recognized profession, to provide for their registration on terms satisfactory to physicians and surgeons as evidence of their having received systematic training, to associate them for mutual help and protection, and for the advantage in every way of their professional work, and, with a view to the attainment of these objects, to obtain a royal charter incorporating the association and authorizing the formation of a register. It was around the second and the fourth of these objects that the principal battle raged. The case of the association was prima facie a strong one. A register of nurses, duly certified as competent, would, it was argued, be a protection against impostors. The certification was to be by a board which would insist on a certain standard of professional proficiency. 3 years' training in a hospital was suggested as the preliminary test. The case on the other side, as developed by Miss Nightingale and her allies, was that the apparent advantages of a register were deceptive. Who was to be protected? Not the hospitals. They protected themselves, without any general register, by their own methods. If any one was to be protected, it must be the public, but the register would rather mislead than protect them. The placing of a name on a register would, at best, only certify that at a certain date the nurse had satisfied the required tests. But the date might be long ago, and the fact of registration would tell nothing of her subsequent conduct or competence. The registration of midwives stood on a different footing from that of nurses, for in the former case a certain definite technical skill is of the essence of the matter. In the case of nursing, character is as much of its essence as any technical qualification. As for the 3 years' training in a hospital, there were hospitals and hospitals, training schools and training schools, and who was to guarantee the guarantors? The General Register would not raise the profession of nursing. It would do an injury to the better nurses by putting them on a level with the worse, and to the profession by stereotyping a minimum standard. The British Nurses Association had published a preliminary register. Miss Nightingale analysed it and found that in the case of nurses trained at one hospital, the private register of that hospital excluded nearly one-third of those entered on the B.N.A.'s register, and that another hospital's register included, as duly certificated, only one-third of those entered on the B.N.A.'s register as trained thereat. You cannot select the good from the inferior by any test or system of examination, but most of all, and first of all, must their moral qualifications be made to stand preeminent in estimation. All this can only be secured by the current supervision, tests, or examination which they receive in their training school or hospital, not by any examination from a foreign body like that proposed by the British Nurses Association. Indeed, those who come best off in such would probably be the ready and forward, not the best nurses. The much vexed question of internal or external examination was, it will be seen, involved in this dispute, but to Miss Nightingale a larger and a more vital issue was at stake. It was a conflict between two ideals, or rather, as she would have said, between a high ideal and a material expediency. Mr. Jowett, though he agreed in her view that nurses cannot be registered and examined any more than mothers, was distressed that she was so greatly perturbed over what seemed to him so small a matter. "It is a comparative trifle," he wrote, May 26, 1892, "among all the work which you have done, and you must not be over anxious." To Miss Nightingale it was not a trifle, but a trial, a possible parting of the ways. It was diverting attention from training homes to examination tests. It was sacrificing a high calling to professional advancement. "There comes a crisis," she wrote to Mr. Jowett (May), "in the lives of all social movements, rough hew them as you will, when the amateur and outward and certifying or registering spirit comes in on the one side, and the mercantile or buying and selling spirit on the other. This has come in the case of nursing in about 30 years, for nursing was born about 30 years ago. The present trial is not persecution, but fashion, and this brings in all sorts of amateur alloy, and public life instead of the life of a calling, and registering instead of training. On the other hand, an extra mercantile spirit has come in, of forcing up wages, regardless of the truism that nursing has been raised from the sink it was, not more by training than by making the hospital, workhouse, infirmary, or district home a place of moral and healthful safeguards, inspiring a sense of duty and a love of the calling. The true way of protecting the public was to extend homes for private nurses on sound lines, aided by the nurses' training schools and hospitals, not by means of a chartered register, to encourage nurses to flock to the institutions which gave the easiest certificate at the least trouble of training. Miss Nightingale could not then regard the dispute as a trifle. It caused her days and nights of grievous anxiety. Her meditations are full of despondency and searchings of heart, both bitter and self-reproachful. The Princess Christian, with the best intentions, was giving her name to undermine Miss Nightingale's ideal. This could not justly be attributed in blame to the Princess. The fault must have been with her, Florence Nightingale, who had misused her opportunities and had failed to impress her ideal on other minds. She was an unprofitable servant, but here, as in all things, the sensitive reproaches of the night watches left no trace of themselves on the work of the day, or rather they left their trace in greater activity and devotion. It was in 1889 that the occasion came for resolute action. The British Nurses Association announced their intention of applying for a charter, and proceeded to enlist public support. Miss Nightingale set to work on the other side. She made the acquaintance at this time of Miss Lux, then as now, 1913, the matron of the London Hospital, who was strongly opposed to the idea of registration. The acquaintance speedily ripened into friendship, and henceforth Miss Nightingale was looked to for support and sympathy by the matron of the London, hardly less than by her of St. Thomas's. Other nurse training schools came into line, and a manifesto was issued announcing their intention to oppose any petition for a charter. There was desultory skirmishing for some time between the registrationists and anti-registrationists. There was a lively polemic in the newspapers. There were as many fly sheets and pamphlets as if it were a theological dispute in a university. In 1891, the British Nurses Association applied to the Board of Trade to be registered as a public company, without the addition of the word "limited" to its name. The memorandum and proposed articles of association were duly filed, and the foremost place was again given, among the declared objects, to a register of trained nurses, and the power to determine from time to time the test for registration. Miss Nightingale and her allies took up the challenge. Through Sir Harry Verney she approached the President of the Board of Trade, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, with a statement of the case against the association. A counter petition was presented, and after full consideration the Board refused the application. The first engagement had thus resulted in a victory for Miss Nightingale. In the same year there was a committee of the House of Lords to inquire into the London hospitals. Mr. Rathbone, coached by Miss Nightingale, gave evidence on the question of the registration of nurses, and the committee reported against it. A second victory. But the registrationists now brought up their most formidable reserves. Permission was obtained from the Sovereign to use the title Royal. Thus strengthened by favour in the highest quarter, the Royal British Nurses Association petitioned the Queen for a Royal Charter. The petition was referred in the usual course to a special committee of the Privy Council, and the two sides marshalled their forces. A campaign fund was raised by the anti-registrationists. Miss Nightingale appealed privately to the Lord President of the Council and wrote various letters, memoranda, statements. She enlisted support from the medical profession. Her old pupils, now in charge of nurse training schools throughout the country, rallied round her. Two petitions of special weight were presented to the Privy Council against the Charter. One was from the Council of the Nightingale Fund, the body which had been the pioneer in promoting the training of nurses. The other was the petition of executive officers, matrons, lady superintendents, and principal assistants of the London and provincial hospitals and nurse training schools, and of members of the medical profession and ladies directly connected with nursing and the training of nurses. The list of signatures, which occupies 23 folio pages, was headed by Florence Nightingale. In the preparation of these documents Miss Nightingale had a large share, though much of the work, especially in the instruction of the lawyers, in consultations and so forth, was done by Mr. Bonham Carter. The Committee of the Privy Council sat in November 1892 to hear the case. Of the first day's proceedings, Miss Nightingale wrote an account in which, as will be seen, she did not let the registrationist dogs have the better of it, but which betrays at the same time serious anxiety about the result. Miss Nightingale to Sir Harry Verney, 10 South Street, November 22, 1892. Yesterday was the first day of the Privy Council trial. We had to change our senior counsel at the last moment because Mr. Finlay was engaged on an election committee, and our previous 4 days were therefore, as you may suppose, very busy. We were fortunate enough to have Sir Richard Webster. Sir Horace Davy opened the ball on behalf of Princess Christian. His speech was dull, and contained only the commonplaces we have heard for a year in favour of the Royal Charter. The judges were Lord Ripon, who only stayed half the time, Lord Monson, and 2 law lords, Lord Hannon and Lord Hobhouse. They appeared to have been chosen as knowing nothing of the matter, and as not having been on the Lords' Committee on Hospitals. Our side, Sir Richard Webster, followed with a masterly speech, masterly from being that of a shrewd man of sense, without rhetoric, and from his splendid getting up of our case at short notice. He put very strongly our contention that character, unregistrable, rather than technical training, makes the nurse, and other of our points. The judges adjourned till Monday in the middle of his speech, where he was saying, as we do, "What is the use of saying that a nurse has had 3 years' training at such a hospital? How can you certify the hospital?" He will resume this subject and others on Monday. The judges asked all the questions, not to the point, that you can fancy men perfectly ignorant of the subject to ask, and which we have answered over and over again. Sir Richard Webster said to Bonham Carter at the end of yesterday, "The judges are dead against us. The Charter pledges itself to admit on the register only nurses of 3 years' hospital training, which the judges pronounced could do no harm. But it provides for itself what may put into its hands the whole control of what constitutes training. Is it not wonderful these men do not see this? Well, we are in God's hands, brother, not in theirs." The Privy Councils. In all my strange life, through which God has guided me so faithfully, oh, that I had been as faithful to Him as He to me, this is the strangest episode of all, to see a number of doctors of the highest eminence giving their names to what they know nothing at all about. Sir James Paget told me himself that the names were asked for at a court ball, following each other like a flock of sheep. To see their council of registration made up of sirs, only one of whom knows anything about nurse training. Sir James Paget himself asked me why can't nurses lodge out as students do. To see these able, good, and shrewd men ignoring that such a thing is sure to fall into a clique. They have let Princess Christian fall into such an one already. She is made a tool of by 2 or 3 people. Lift up your heads, ye gates, and the King of Glory shall come in. Who is the King of Glory? The Lord strong in battle. O God of battles, steel thy soldiers' hearts against happy-go-luckiness, against courtiership, fashion, and mere money-making on the part of the nurses and their societies. P.S. This trial will cost us £700 at least. The committee took time to consider their advice to Her Majesty. In May 1893 the decision was announced. The committee advised Her Majesty in Council to grant a charter in accordance with a draft revised by them. On June 6 the charter was granted. Each side claimed the victory. The Nursing Record, June 15, an organ of the registrationists, claimed that they had won all, and even more than all, that they asked, and declared proudly that henceforth members of the Royal Chartered Association will hold a higher position than any others. The hospital, on the other side, argued that all this was ill-founded, but if the British nurses wanted to be congratulated on nothing, we are willing to congratulate them. June 24. The fight before the Privy Council now became a fight in the press on the meaning of the verdict. The anti-registrationists, headed by Miss Nightingale and the Duke of Westminster, put their interpretation in a quiet letter to the Times, July 3, which the Royal British Nurses Association hotly denounced as untrue in fact and injurious in intention, July 6. The fact was that the Lords of the Council had steered a middle course. They granted the Charter, but in it, for the words "the maintenance of a list or register of nurses, showing as to each nurse registered," etc., they substituted the words "the maintenance of a list of persons who may have applied to have their names entered therein as nurses," etc. There was nothing in the Charter which gave any nurse the right to call herself chartered or registered. What the promoters hoped we need not discuss. What the opponents feared was a charter in such terms as would give the corporation an authoritative and perhaps ultimately an exclusive right to register nurses, and thereby would give it also indirect control over nurse training. No such charter was obtained. And in this sense the opposition of Miss Nightingale and her friends had prevailed. The controversy is not dead, but so far her view has continued to prevail, and the official registration of nurses is still a pious hope to its supporters, a heresy to its opponents. Miss Nightingale greatly deplored the feud, but sought to bring good out of evil. 40 years hence, she wrote to Mr. Rathbone (February 26, 1891), such a scheme might not be preposterous, provided the intermediate time be diligently and successfully employed in levelling up, that is, in making all nurses at least equal to the best trained nurses of this day, and in levelling up training schools in like manner. "Great good may be done," she wrote to Mr. Jowett (May 1892), "by rousing our side to an increased earnestness about 1. Providing homes for nurses while engaged in their work of nursing, and 2. Full private hospital registers, tracing the careers of nurses trained by them." There were no years in which Miss Nightingale herself gave more thought and trouble than in 1891 3 to personal care for the affairs of the Nightingale School. In a paper which Miss Nightingale was invited to contribute to a Congress on Women's Work, held at Chicago in 1893, she treated the whole subject of nursing. This paper embodies in a methodical form her characteristic views, and in it she takes occasion in several places to touch obliquely upon the controversy described in preceding pages. A new art and a new science has been created since and within the last 40 years, and with it a new profession, so they say. We say calling. She dwells on the conditions necessary to make a good training school for nurses. She dilates upon the dangers to which nursing is subject. These are fashion on the one side, and a consequent want of earnestness; mere money-getting on the other side, and a mechanical view of nursing. Can it be possible that a testimonial or certificate of 3 years' so-called training or service from a hospital, any hospital with a certain number of beds, can be accepted as sufficient to certify a nurse for a place in a public register? As well might we not take a certificate from any garden of a certain number of acres that plants are certified valuable if they have been 3 years in the garden. Then there was imminent danger of stereotyping instead of progressing. No system can endure that does not march. Objects of registration not capable of being gained by a public register. The whole paper is written with a good deal of gusto. The volume in which it appeared was dedicated to Princess Christian. In the following year Miss Nightingale had some correspondence with the Princess, who, as President of the Royal British Nurses Association, had made a scheme for enrolling a war nursing reserve through the hospitals, and had written to consult Miss Nightingale about it. The hospital sisters were, according to this scheme, to be placed in subordination to the Army Sisters, nurses with the larger experience under those with the smaller. This seemed to Miss Nightingale a mistake, and she noted other details in which the scheme appeared to her inadequately considered. She pointed these things out faithfully to the Princess, but the correspondence on both sides was cordial. The letters from the Princess made Miss Nightingale exclaim how gracefully royalty can do things, and on her part she desired to be conciliatory. "We should, I think, be earnestly anxious," she wrote, "to do what we can for Princess Christian as she holds out the flag of truce, in order to put an end as far as we can to all this bickering, which does such harm to the cause." There were thoughts in Miss Nightingale's mind throughout this controversy still deeper than any which have yet been noticed. She had an esoteric conception of nursing which made her regard the view of it as a registrable business in the light almost of sacrilege. A profession, so they say, we say calling, and not only a calling, but a form through which religious satisfaction might be found. Her view comes out in a letter which she wrote to Mr. Jowett in 1889 in the course of a discussion with him upon the necessity of external forms for the religious life. "You say that mystical or spiritual religion is not enough for most people without outward form. And I may say I can never remember a time when it was not the question of my life. Not so much for myself as for others. For myself, the mystical or spiritual religion, as laid down by St. John's Gospel, however imperfectly I have lived up to it, was and is enough. But the two thoughts which God has given me all my whole life have been, first, to infuse the mystical religion into the forms of others, always thinking they would show it forth much better than I, especially among women, to make them the handmaids of the Lord. Secondly, to give them an organization for their activity in which they could be trained to be the handmaids of the Lord. Training for women was then unknown, unwished for, and is the discovery of the last 30 years. One could have taken up the school education of the poor, but one was specially called then to hospitals and nursing, both sanitation and nursing proper. This was then the organization which we had to begin with, to attract respectable women and give religious women a form for their activity. When very many years ago I planned a future, my one idea was not organizing a hospital, but organizing a religion. Now, handmaids of the Lord cannot be certified by external examiners, nor can a religious service be guaranteed by registers. Does this view of the matter seem a little transcendental? It was in accord, at any rate, with another of Miss Nightingale's fundamental doctrines, which, in its application to the controversy, had a severely practical force. Nursing, she held, is a progressive art, in which to stand still is to go back. No note is more often struck in her addresses to nurses. She held, as may already have been gathered from the foregoing summary of her case, that the registrationists, consciously or unconsciously, had lost hold of that essential truth about nursing. It was right that precautions should be taken against impostors, and that the fullest inquiries should be made. Miss Nightingale's objection was not to the precautions, but to their misleading nature, not to the tests, but to their inadequacy. The only real and sufficient guarantee in the case of an art in which the training, both technical and moral, is a continuous process was, she held, that the public should be able to obtain a recent recommendation of the nurse, who was to be passed on from one doctor, hospital, or superintendent to another, with something of the same elaborate record of work and character that she herself required in the case of Nightingale probationers and nurses. End of The Nurses' Battle and Health in the Village, 1 and 2. Part 7, Chapter 7 of the Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2, by Edward Tyas Cook. The Nurses' Battle and Health in the Village, continued. Parts 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. 3. The fate of Miss Nightingale's work in the cause of public health, both in India and at home, was checkered during these years, even as was that in the cause of trained nursing. But here again substantial advance was made in several directions. There was once a Secretary of State who entered the India Office possessed by a strong and personal interest in sanitation. There was some excitement in the office. There were one or two men around the Minister who heartily approved. There were more who shook their heads. The Minister must have been listening, they thought, directly or indirectly, to a certain lady's beautiful nonsense. He was too impressionable. He was anxious to do things in spite of the claims of economy. He was too much in a hurry. They took him in hand in order to quiet him down. They thought to have succeeded in making him satisfied to leave things as they were. The other side became conscious of a change. "It is essential," wrote one of them to a certain lady, "that you should see him at once." The lady, who was the hope of one side and the fear of the other, was Miss Nightingale. The Minister need not be identified, for these things, though true also of a particular case and time, are here given as a general allegory. For 30 years and more, through all changes and chances in the political world, Miss Nightingale was a permanent force, importuning, indoctrinating, inspiring in the interests of better sanitary administration. For some time after the early months of 1885, the political situation was very unsettled. The Government formed by Lord Salisbury after the defeat of Mr. Gladstone in June was only a cabinet of caretakers, and it was not worth Miss Nightingale's while to approach any of them. Besides, she instinctively recognized the Secretary of State for India as a hopeless subject. She was right. Lord Randolph Churchill was all against Lord Ripon, and all for economy. When Lord Salisbury's Government was in turn overthrown after the general election in December, Miss Nightingale, through various channels, approached Mr. Gladstone and begged him to send Lord Ripon to the India Office. He returned polite but evasive answers, and so controversial an appointment was obviously improbable. Lord Ripon went to the Admiralty. The excitement of the first Home Rule Bill followed. The Government was defeated. Another general election was necessary, and all was in confusion. Dr. Sutherland, anxious to retire from the public service, for he was now nearly 80, was pressing Miss Nightingale to devise measures for safeguarding his department after he was gone. She pressed him to stay on yet a while. During the political earthquakes of the last 8 months, still continuing, no permanent interest can be expected, she wrote to him July 20, 1886, in those who are so little permanent. The subject excruciates me. Lord Ripon, who came to see her 10 days later, thought that the times were unpropitious generally for good causes, an opinion which defeated ministers are apt to hold. "There are waves in these matters," he said. "The thing is to come in upon the crest of the waves. You would have done nothing for the army and sanitation if it had not been for the crash in the Crimea. Now the wave is against India." Miss Nightingale, however, did not allow herself to be tempted into inactivity by this wave theory. For the moment, indeed, there was nothing to be done with ministers at home, but she had not been neglectful of cultivating relations with Anglo-Indians and Indians in positions of influence. In 1885 she had added Sir Neville Chamberlain and Sir Peter Lumsden to her list of Anglo-Indian acquaintances. Lord Reay had called upon her March 1885 before leaving to take up the governorship of Bombay, and she corresponded with him frequently on sanitary subjects. In October, Lord Roberts came before going out to India as Commander-in-Chief. Miss Nightingale took great pains with this interview. Dr. Sutherland having furnished her in advance with an admirable synopsis of what might still be done to improve the health and welfare of the troops. Lord Roberts's command was fruitful of some reforms in which Miss Nightingale had been a pioneer. He established a club or institute in every British regiment and battery in India. He closed canteens. He opened coffee stalls. He established an Army Temperance Association. No letter which Miss Nightingale received in her Jubilee year can have pleased her more than one which the Commander-in-Chief in India sent her from Simla on August 6. In this letter Lord Roberts told her that the Government of India had sanctioned the employment of female nurses in the military hospitals. A commencement was to be made at the two large military centres of Ambala and Rawalpindi, and 18 nurses with lady superintendents in each case were to be sent out from England at once. The selection of nurses was entrusted to Surgeon General Arthur Payne, who in the following month had several interviews with Miss Nightingale. Thus, after 22 years, was the scheme which she had put before Sir John Lawrence brought to fruition. Miss Nightingale saw the superintendents before they went out, and letters from them were now added to the pile of those which she received from hospitals throughout the world, reporting progress or asking advice. Miss C.G. Loach wrote from Rawalpindi, April 12, 1888, describing how she had found that, as Miss Nightingale always said, the education of the orderlies was the most important thing for the nurses to do. The official introduction of female nursing into the Indian military hospitals was by no means the only satisfaction which Miss Nightingale received during Lord Dufferin's Viceroyalty. He had declared himself ignorant of Indian sanitary things, but had promised to learn, and not only was he as good as his word, but Lady Dufferin was keenly interested also. She founded the National Association for Supplying Medical Aid to the Women of India. Miss Nightingale had long been interested in the subject, and Lady Dufferin consulted her at every stage. One of the first things needful, Lady Dufferin had written September 19, 1885, was a supply of sanitary tracts. In using the word tract, I am thinking of some little books in Hindustani written by ALOE, which I am obliged to read as part of my studies in the language. They are stories with a moral, and I don't see why something of the kind might not be published with health as a moral. Miss Nightingale took great pains in collecting suitable raw material, and during the remainder of Lord Dufferin's Viceroyalty wrote to her by almost every mail. 4. Yet more was to be fired during Lord Dufferin's Viceroyalty of sanitary shot supplied, as he had requested, by Miss Nightingale. But we must now turn back to London, where, partly from circumstances and partly of necessity, Miss Nightingale was presently engaged in a vigorous campaign. There is a large bundle of correspondence during these years upon a matter which is referred to in some of the letters as the Sutherland succession. Now Dr. Sutherland was in Miss Nightingale's eyes the indispensable man, not any longer in the personal sense, as described in an earlier chapter, for he was now a very old man, and was only able to help her on rare occasions. She had already found a successor in this personal sense, or rather she had put Dr. Sutherland's place into commission. Sir William Wedderburn was during these later years her most constant collaborator in Indian matters, and for the rest she relied upon Sir Douglas Galton. She had often chafed at Dr. Sutherland's delays, but I expect that when Sir Douglas succeeded to him, she may in one respect have parodied to herself the well-known Cambridge epigram, and said, "Poor Dr. Sutherland, we never felt his loss before." For Sir Douglas Galton, though devoted also to Miss Nightingale's service, was an exceedingly busy and much travelling man, and she had to be content with the crumbs of his time. "As it was some time in the dark ages," she wrote (May 13, 1887), "since I saw you last, my memory, impaired by years, cannot fix the date within a decade. I seize the first day you kindly offer." And again, December 3, 1889, "I must take your leavings, as beggars must not be choosers. Yes, please, your dog will see you to-morrow on your way from Euston for as long as you can stop." Miss Nightingale relied greatly on Sir Douglas Galton's advice. She had a very high opinion not only of his thorough knowledge of all sanitary subjects, but of his sound judgment generally. From the personal point of view, then, Dr. Sutherland was gone already, but in his official capacity he was still indispensable. He was the mainspring of the system of sanitary administration, both for the Home Army and for India, which Miss Nightingale had built up. He was the one paid working member, and he was also the working brain of the Army Sanitary Committee, and it was to that committee that Indian sanitary reports were referred. But he was impatient to retire. At any moment his health might become worse, and he might send in his resignation before arrangements had been made for the appointment of a successor. So long as he remained at his post, no changes were likely to be made, but if he retired, it was very probable that no successor would be appointed, and that the whole system would collapse. That the heads of the Army were ignorant of Dr. Sutherland's services had been burnt in upon Miss Nightingale's mind a few years before. In discussing some matter of Army nursing with the Minister of the day, she had suggested the reference of it to Dr. Sutherland. "Who is he?" said the Minister. "I have never heard of him." At the India Office it was much the same. "I don't think," wrote a friend (Sept. 8, 1886), "that this office in general appreciates the importance of those reviews of Indian sanitary matters of which Dr. Sutherland has been the real author hitherto." The whole system would lapse, he feared, unless she was able to do something. Nor was this all. The sanitary service in India itself was in danger. The annexation of Burma had made retrenchment necessary. A Finance Committee was at work in recommending economies, and Miss Nightingale received private information that the Sanitary Commissioners were marked down by the Committee for destruction. The whole edifice thus seemed to be crumbling. This was what she had in her mind when, in the Jubilee retrospect, quoted at the beginning of the chapter, she said that the work of 30 years had all to be done again. She turned with all her old energy to efforts commensurate to the threatened calamity. In accordance with her usual method, she first consulted many influential friends, Lord Ripon amongst others, and then acted with great energy. She wrote a long statement to Lord Dufferin, November 5. "I have sent your letter in extenso," he replied, January 18, 1887, "to the head of the Finance Committee. You should understand that it does not at all follow, because the Committee recommend a thing, that their recommendation will, as a matter of course, be accepted by the Government. On the contrary, I will go most carefully into this question, in which you naturally take so deep an interest, and will be careful to have it thoroughly discussed in Council by my colleagues, with the advantage of having had your views placed before them." A few months later came welcome news. Lord Dufferin to Miss Nightingale, Simla, August 20, 1887. I write you a little line to tell you that the Indian Government have finally determined not to sanction the proposals of the Finance Commission for the abolition of the Sanitary Commissioners, about which you were naturally alarmed. There is no doubt that the Finance Commission was in a position to prove that these officers had been able to do very little, owing to the unwillingness, or rather the inability, of the local authorities to supply funds, and in some cases to their own listlessness and want of energy. We are now, however, taking the question up, and the result of the attack upon your protégés will be not their disappearance, but their being compelled to give us the worth of the money we spend upon them. I am also inviting all the local governments to put the whole subject of sanitation upon a more satisfactory footing, and to establish a system of concerted action and a well worked out program, in accordance with which, from year to year, their operations are to be conducted. I cannot say how grateful I am to Sir Harry Verney for his kindness in writing me such interesting and pleasant letters. In them he tells me from time to time, I am afraid I cannot say of your well-being, but of your unflagging energy in the pursuit of your noble and useful aims. Meanwhile, Miss Nightingale had been busy with Ministers at home. In the latter half of 1886, Lord Salisbury's Government was firmly seated, and she received visits from the Secretaries of State for India and for War, Lord Cross and Mr. W. H. Smith. She found Lord Cross most sympathetic. He saw her from time to time during following years, and they had a good deal of correspondence. To Mr. W. H. Smith she paid her highest compliment. In some ways he reminded her, she said in her notes, of Sidney Herbert. Superficially, and in several of their real characteristics, no two men could be more unlike. But in certain respects Mr. Smith resembled her ideal of a war minister. He had a sincere concern for the welfare, alike physical and moral, of the soldiers, and he showed a quick and industrious aptitude for administrative detail. She saw Mr. Smith several times, and at his request had an interview with the Chaplain General. It seemed as if the work which she had done with Sidney Herbert might be resumed with Mr. Smith, when there was a thunderclap from a clear sky. Lord Randolph Churchill resigned. The Ministry was for a while in confusion, and Miss Nightingale in despair. "We are unlucky," she wrote to Sir Douglas Galton, December 23. "As soon as we seem to have got hold of two Secretaries of State, this Randolph goes out. The Cabinet will have to be remodelled, and perhaps we shall lose our men. All the more reason for doing something at once." Of her two men, the one was taken, the other left. Mr. W. H. Smith became First Lord of the Treasury, but Lord Cross remained at the India Office. "I am very sorry to give up the War Office," said Mr. Smith to Miss Nightingale, "but I am told it is my duty, and duty leaves no choice." She begged him to indoctrinate his successor, Mr. Edward Stanhope. She was already acquainted with him, and presently he came to see her. It was with peculiar satisfaction that she presently heard of the Government's intention to take a loan for 4 millions for the building of new barracks and the reconstruction of old ones. This was a resumption of the work of Sidney Herbert 30 years after. An early intimation of this policy made Miss Nightingale the more anxious about the fate of the Army Sanitary Committee. If the sanitary condition of the barracks was to be improved, it was all important that a strong Sanitary Committee should be in existence to supervise the work. At first, however, she had been unable to secure any promise about the Sutherland succession. The War Office would not consider the matter until a vacancy occurred. The India Office would do nothing until it knew what the War Office meant to do. In 1888 the long-threatened thing happened. Dr. Sutherland resigned. No successor was appointed. The whole subject, she was informed, was under consideration, and then under reconsideration. Ultimately, Mr. Stanhope, after interviews with Miss Nightingale, reconstituted the Committee, June 1890. Sir Douglas Galton remained upon it. Dr. J. Marston was appointed paid member in succession to Dr. Sutherland, and Miss Nightingale's friend and ally, Surgeon General J. W. Cunningham, formerly Sanitary Commissioner with the Government of India, was appointed as an Indian expert. Her friend, Mr. J. Frederick, retained his post as secretary to the committee. The danger was overpast. 5. Sanitary reports from India were still to be referred to the committee, but Miss Nightingale and some of her friends thought that the time had come for an advance in India. Lord Cross was so sympathetic that the occasion seemed opportune for reviving her former plea for a sanitary department in India which should be more directly executive. Sir Henry Cunningham, married to a niece of Sir Harry Verney, had been in communication with her for some years. He was a judge of the High Court of Calcutta, and had taken an active part in the cause of sanitation in that city. He now prepared a memorandum advocating a forward policy. Miss Nightingale's ally on the India Council, Sir Henry Yule, prepared another, which was so far approved by the Secretary of State that he ordered it to be circulated in the office as the draft of a proposed dispatch to the Government of India. This draft was, in fact, the joint production of Sir Henry Cunningham, Colonel Yule, and Miss Nightingale. It went the rounds. It was minuted on. It was considered and reconsidered, printed and reprinted. Sometimes the report to Miss Nightingale was that it would be adopted and sent; at other times that it had been postponed for further revision, recirculation, and reconsideration. Ultimately it became in some sort out of date, because the Government of India took a step on its own motion in accordance with the intention which Lord Dufferin had already communicated to Miss Nightingale. By resolution dated July 27, 1888, the Government of India provided for the constitution of a sanitary board in every province, which would not only advise the Government and local authorities upon sanitary measures, but would also be an executive agency. The passages in which the latter point is insisted upon might have been written by Miss Nightingale herself. Lord Dufferin's term of office was now drawing to a close. He had proved himself an apt pupil of the governess of Governors General. As on the voyage out he had promised to do her bidding, so now on the voyage home he gave some account of his stewardship. Lord Dufferin to Miss Nightingale, SS Kaiser 1 Hind, at sea, December 26, 1888. We are now on our way home and are having a beautiful passage, thanks to which we are all picking up wonderfully, and shall arrive in Europe quite rejuvenated. This is merely a line to apologize for having sent you the report of a speech I made at Calcutta recently. I would not have troubled you with it, were it not that on page 15 I have tried to give a parting lift to sanitation. My ladies go home at once, but I, alas, am compelled to take up my business at Rome, so that I shall not get my holiday for another 2 or 3 months. Amongst the first persons whose hands I hope to come and kiss will be yours. Lord Dufferin was succeeded by Lord Lansdowne, who was introduced to Miss Nightingale by Mr. Jowett. She saw Lord Lansdowne twice before he left for India, and they corresponded frequently on sanitary affairs. He did much for us in every way, is her comment on his viceroyalty. 6. The constitution of the sanitary boards in India proceeded with due regard to the periods of Indian cosmogony, and Miss Nightingale watched their formation and their proceedings carefully, putting in words of encouragement, expostulation, or reminder whenever and wherever an opportunity was offered or could be made. It was soon apparent that the great obstacle to sanitary progress among the masses of India lay, where perhaps for many generations it is still likely to lie, in the immobility of immemorial custom, especially in the villages. Education was making some slight impression, but the force of passive resistance, combined with lack of funds, prevented the hope of any rapid or signal advance. Recognition of these factors now led Miss Nightingale to concentrate her efforts upon village sanitation, and a scheme for combining the power of education with a financial expedient formed the motive for the last of her Indian campaigns. Miss Nightingale had been watching with the closest attention the Bombay Village Sanitation Bill, a measure first projected in 1887. She analysed and criticised it, and sent her views to Lord Cross at the India Office and to Lord Lansdowne and Lord Reay in India. Her main objection was to the exclusion from the scope of the Bill of the smaller villages, an exclusion which did not figure in the revised draft of 1889. She wrote letters for circulation in India to native associations in explanation and support of village sanitation. There was some slight stirring of Indian opinion, and Miss Nightingale's next concern was to give to it articulate expression in London. The holding of an International Congress of Hygiene and Demography in the autumn of 1891 furnished an opportunity. Sir Douglas Galton was chairman of the organizing committee of the Congress, so that there was no difficulty in arranging for an Indian section. Miss Nightingale then circularized the Native Association in Bombay, begging that representatives might be sent to the Congress and papers be contributed by Indian gentlemen. This was done, and Miss Nightingale interested herself greatly in the Congress. Sir Harry Verney, she wrote to Sir Douglas Galton, August 1, 1891, renews his invitations to Claydon to the native Indian delegates, 3 or 4 at a time. I have seen Mr. Bownagree, who seems to be acting for the other native gentlemen, not yet come, and asked him to manage this as is most suitable to these gentlemen. I may hope to see them one by one, if I am able to be there. I have also seen of delegates Sir William Moore and Dr. Payne and Sir W. Wedderburn. Mr. Digby seems to be doing a great work. Do you remember that it is 30 years tomorrow since Sidney Herbert died? The Congress was opened by the Prince of Wales, August 10, whose speech on the occasion formed the text of many leading articles in the press. People talked, he said, of preventable diseases, but if preventable, why not prevented? It was, however, in the Indian section that Miss Nightingale was most interested, and she used it to promote her schemes. The Bombay Village Sanitation Act was failing to produce the desired results because there were no funds definitely allocated to sanitation. Sanitary education was making some little progress, but not enough, in view of the poverty of Indian villages, to make it likely that additional taxation would be borne. In these circumstances, might not some portion of the existing taxation, the village cesses, be appropriated to sanitation as a first charge? Until the minimum of sanitation is completed, until the cess of a particular village has been appropriated to it, while typhoidal or choleric disease is still prevalent, should not the claims for any general purposes be postponed? Such was Miss Nightingale's case. She had a memorandum drawn up embodying it in short form, and canvassed for signatures to it among members of the Indian section of the Congress. Sir Douglas Galton, Sir George Birdwood, Sir William Guyer Hunter, Sir William Wedderburn, Dr. Courfield, and Dr. Poore were among those who signed it. Miss Nightingale then forwarded the memorandum with a covering letter going more fully into the case to the Secretary of State. She wrote at the same time to the Governor-General and to the Governor of Bombay. Lord Cross received the communication very sympathetically, and forwarded it at once, April 1892, to the Government of India. Lord Lansdowne then circulated Miss Nightingale's dispatch among the local governments, and during following years a formidable mass of printed papers accumulated, reporting on the proposals made by Miss Nightingale relative to the better application of the proceeds of village cesses to the purposes of sanitation. The official view, though not unsympathetic to Miss Nightingale's object, was opposed to her financial expedient. It was thought that other purposes, especially the improvement of roads, etc., had a claim prior to sanitation. "It seems clear," wrote Sir William Wedderburn to her (July 7, 1893), "that you have most effectively drawn attention to the subject." The official replies are what we might naturally expect, but, reading between the lines, I think they admit the justice of our contention, and have been impressed by your action. Perhaps this was to some extent the case. You have most effectively drawn attention to the subject. That was perhaps the main service which during these years Miss Nightingale rendered to the cause of Indian sanitation. Certainly she was importunate in asking successive Governors General for reports of progress. Her importunity often caused them to jog the elbows of local governments, and she may thus not unjustly be credited with such gradual progress as was made. The final reply to Miss Nightingale's immediate suggestion was sent in a dispatch to the Secretary of State, Mr. Fowler, from the Government of India in 1894, March 28, enclosing letters on her memorandum from the several local governments. The Government of India declined for various reasons to adopt her suggestion, but admitting that something ought to be done, considered that sanitation in its simplest form of a pure water supply and simple latrine arrangements should be regarded as having to some extent a claim on provincial revenues, and it promised to press this claim upon local governments and administrations as opportunity offers. A covering letter to Miss Nightingale from the Secretary of State, May 9, 1894, while informing her that Mr. Fowler is disposed to accept the view taken by the Government of India, expressed the belief that India will benefit by the renewed attention which your action has caused to be given to the important subject of rural sanitary reform. There are passages in some of the replies from local governments enclosed in the dispatch which bear out this belief. Miss Nightingale, on her own part, was diligent in appeals to Indian gentlemen to bestir themselves. She had an ally at this time in Sir William Wilson Hunter, who, in his fortnightly summary of Indian affairs in the Times, sometimes enforced her points or called attention to her writings. She had urged her friend to write a detailed description of the actual working of Indian administration, and this he did in 1892. The preface to his book was a dedicatory letter to Miss Nightingale. In it he says that the book was written at her request, describes its scope, and thus concludes: "Now that the work is done, to whom can I more fitly dedicate it than to you, dear Miss Nightingale, to you, whose life has been a long devotion to the stricken ones of the earth, to you whose deep sympathy with the peoples of India no years of suffering or of sickness are able to abate." In her own pieces written at this date, Miss Nightingale preached more especially the gospel of health missionaries for rural India. Some reference to progress made in this respect will be found in a later chapter. She believed in state action, but no less in self-help, and this point of view is emphasized in a retrospect of her work for India, which she wrote, or partly wrote, probably as hints for some vernacular publication in 1889. Some passages from the document here rearranged may fitly close this account of her later Indian work. Miss Nightingale saw in the Queen's Proclamation of 1858 a text and a living principle to fulfil. Every Englishman and Englishwoman interested in India were bound in duty and in honour to do their utmost to help British subjects to understand the principle and to practice the life. To this she has adhered through illness and overwork for 31 years. First attracted to India by the vital necessity of health for 200 or 250 millions, imperilled by sanitary ignorance, apathy, or neglect, she believed it to be a fact that since the world began, criminals have not destroyed more life and property than do epidemic diseases, the result of well-known insanitary conditions, every year in India. The protection of life and property from preventable epidemics ranks next to protection from criminals as a responsibility of government, if indeed it is not even higher in importance. The first thing was to awaken the government. This was done by the Royal Commission upon the Sanitary State of the Army in India, which was the origin of practical action for the vast native population. But the difficulties were enormous. You must have the people on your side, and the people, alas, did not care. You cannot give health to the people against their wills, as you can lock up people against their wills. Impressed by these facts, Miss Nightingale saw the necessity of sanitary missionaries among the people, of sanitary manuals and primers in the schools. Give me the schools of a country, and I care not who makes its laws. Of sanitary publications of all kinds, for man, woman, and child. The Sanitary Commissioner, in one instance at least, has been a sanitary missionary, crying out, "Bestir yourselves, gentlemen! Don't you see we are all dying?" The people must be awakened not to call on the goddess of epidemics, but to call upon the Sirkar to do its part, and also to bestir themselves to do theirs in the matter of cleanliness and pure water. Miss Nightingale found in local government the only remedy, in local government combined with education. The paper touches also upon Miss Nightingale's interest in irrigation, land tenure, usury, agriculture, and in all these matters connects state action with self-help. To the native gentlemen it is that Miss Nightingale appeals. She appeals to them also on the sanitary point, and first of all it is for them to influence their ladies. Let them lead in their own families in domestic sanitation. Then doubtless the lady will lead in general sanitation in India as she does in England. Another passage gives incidentally an autobiographical summary. Miss Nightingale has deeply sympathized with the honourable efforts of the National Congress, which has now held 3 sessions, in which its temperate support of political reforms has been no less remarkable for wisdom than for loyalty. But her whole life has been given deliberately, not for political, but for social and administrative progress. 7. At the time when Miss Nightingale's Indian work was thus largely concentrated upon village sanitation, she was no less busily employed, though in a different way, upon work of a like kind at home. Her interest in local affairs at Claydon has already been touched upon, and this was much increased after the death of her sister in 1890. Lady Verney had been a sufferer for many years, but had borne her illness with unflagging spirit. In May 1890 she was in London very ill, and was counting the hours to her removal to Claydon, but she would not give up a Sunday in town, a day which Florence now kept sacred for her sister. On Sunday, May 4, Lady Verney was carried into Florence's room, and the sisters did not see each other again. On Monday, Lady Verney was moved to Claydon, and there a week later, on Florence's birthday, she died. "You contributed more than any one," wrote Sir Harry, May 15, "to what enjoyment of life was hers. I have no comfort so great as to hold intercourse with you. You and I were the objects of her tender love, and her love for you was intense. It was delightful to me to hear her speak of you, and to see her face, perhaps distorted with pain, look happy when she thought of you." Miss Nightingale at once went to Claydon, where she remained for several months. Sir Harry, now in his 90th year, relied greatly upon his sister-in-law, and for the remainder of his life she devoted herself to him with constant solicitude. He was never happy if many days passed without sight of her or hearing from her. The butler always put Miss Nightingale's letter on the top of his master's morning pile, and no mouthful of breakfast was eaten till he had read it through. When he was in the country and she in London, he was always wanting to run up to town for the day, to buy a new waistcoat, or to consult his solicitor. Any excuse would serve, so that he could see his sister-in-law in South Street. They used to say at Claydon that there was a sure way of discovering whether Sir Harry found a new guest sympathetic or not. If he did, the conversation was invariably turned to Miss Nightingale. Upon the death of her sister, Claydon became Miss Nightingale's country home, and she brought her managerial thoroughness into play there. She looked into Sir Harry's affairs, interested herself greatly in the estate, inquired into the conditions of surrounding village life, made acquaintance with local doctors. These interests brought home to her the conviction that village sanitation was necessary to civilize England hardly less than India, and she saw that as in India, so in England, education must be one at least of the civilizing agencies. She set herself to make a beginning where her lot now happened to be cast, in Buckinghamshire. The time was favourable to a new experiment. County councils had been established by the Act of 1888. In 1889 they were empowered to levy and expend money upon technical education. By the Local Taxation Act of 1890 they received a windfall for the same purpose from what was known as the "whisky money." Funds were thus available, and the definition of technical education was wide. Why should not some of it be used for education in the science of health at home? Mr. Frederick Verney was chairman of the Technical Education Committee of North Bucks, and with Miss Nightingale, as he said, to inspire, advise, and guide, the thing was done. She was already, as we have heard, possessed by the idea of the district nurse as health missioner. It now occurred to her to institute an order of health missioners as such. The health officer for the district, Dr. Diath, was first employed to train ladies for the work by means of lectures and classes. The instruction was practical as well as theoretical, for the doctor took his pupils with him to some of the villages, introduced the ladies to the village mothers, and pointed out particular matters in which knowledge, sympathetically given, might be invaluable to the cottagers. An independent examination followed, and the ladies who passed it satisfactorily were, after a period of probation in practical work, granted certificates as health missioners, in which capacity some of them were engaged by the Technical Education Committee to visit and lecture in the country villages. The scheme, started in the spring of 1892, was a simple one, but it involved Miss Nightingale, as huge bundles of documents attest, in much labour for 2 or 3 years. She enlisted recruits, collected the best that was known and thought about simple sanitary instruction, considered syllabuses and examination papers, corresponded with other technical education committees, wrote memoranda and letters on the subject. To the Women Workers' Conference held at Leeds in November 1893, she sent a paper dealing exhaustively with the whole subject of rural hygiene, a paper which is unhappily by no means out of date today, though the work in which Miss Nightingale was a pioneer has branched out in many directions. "We want duly qualified sanitary inspectors," she wrote, and she was delighted when she heard a few years later of the good work done by some women sanitary inspectors in the North. Full qualification, practical training she insisted upon. And then something else was wanted also. Her last word to the health missioner was the same as to the nurse. The work that tells is the work of the skilful hand, directed by the cool head, and inspired by the loving heart. The nurses' battle and health in the village continued. Parts 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Part 7, Chapter 8 of the Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2 by Edward Tyas Cook. Part 7, Chapter 8, Mr. Jowett and Other Friends, Parts 1 and 2. Let every dawn of morning be to you as the beginning of life, and every setting sun be to you as its close. Then let every one of these short lives leave its sure record of some kindly thing done for others. Ruskin. The last chapter was largely concerned with Miss Nightingale's activity in public affairs and with acquaintanceships which she formed in connection with them. In such affairs she was forcible, clear-sighted, methodical. Sir Bartle Frere, on first making her acquaintance, had said to a friend that it was "a great pleasure to meet such a good man of business as Miss Nightingale." But she was many-sided, and even in her converse with men or women on public affairs, she was generally something more than a good man of business. Much of her influence was due to the fact that so many of those who first saw her as a matter of affairs became her friends, and that to the qualities of a good man of business she added those of a richly sympathetic nature. This aspect of Miss Nightingale's life and character has already been illustrated sufficiently in the case of her relations with matrons, superintendents, and nurses. It may be discerned clearly enough, too, in the account of her official work with Sidney Herbert and other of her earlier allies. But it was as marked in her later as in her earlier years, and in relation to the men as to the women with whom she was brought into touch. In reading her collection of letters from various doctors and officials of all sorts, I have been struck many times with a quick change of atmosphere. The correspondence begins on a formal note. Her correspondent will be pleased to make the acquaintance of a lady so justly esteemed, etc., etc. The interview has taken place, or a few letters have passed, and then the note alters. Wives or sons or daughters have been to see her, or kindly inquiries and messages have been sent, and the correspondence becomes as between old family friends. Young and old alike felt the sympathetic touch of Miss Nightingale's manner. The name of Mr. J. Frederick has been mentioned in earlier pages. He was a junior clerk in the War Office when Miss Nightingale first made his acquaintance. Not many months had passed before she was helpfully interested both in his family and in various good works to which he devoted his spare time. There is much correspondence during the years with which we were concerned in the last chapter with Mr. (now Sir Robert) Morant, at that time tutor in the royal family of Siam. Miss Nightingale had made his acquaintance before he left for Siam, and he came to see her when he was on leave in England, leave apparently meaning, she wrote, September 24, 1891, working on his Siamese subjects 23 hours out of the 24. She became almost as much interested in Siamese affairs as in those of India itself, but the letters show that the public interest was combined with a personal and almost motherly affection. Mr. J. Croft, on the staff at St. Thomas's, who had for many years been medical instructor to the Nightingale probationers, resigned that post in 1892, and in returning thanks for a testimonial described the pleasure he had found in working under so lovable and adorable a leader as Miss Nightingale. Colonel Yule had first made Miss Nightingale's acquaintance in an official capacity as the member of the India Council, charged with sanitary affairs, but he soon came to love her as a friend. In 1889 he was ill, and wrote her a valedictory letter, May 2, in which, after giving advice about some official matters, he said, "As long as I live, but I am not counting on that as a long period, it will be a happiness to think that I was brought into communication with you. Useless as I fear I have been in your great task, in fact my strength had already begun to fail. And so, dear Miss Nightingale, I take my leave. Let it be with the words of the fourth book of Moses, chapter 6, and those that come after us will put in your mouth those of Job 29. His strength failed more rapidly, and in his last illness he craved to know that Miss Nightingale had not forgotten him. She sent a message of fervent gratitude. "I will look at it not as misapplied to myself," he answered December 17, a few days before his death, "but as part of the large and generous nature which you are ready to apply to others who little deserve it. I praise God for the privilege of having known you. I am sunk very low in strength, and cannot write with my own hand, so use that of one of my oldest and dearest friends. God bless and keep you to the end, as you have been for so many years a pillar in Christ's kingdom of love, and of this state of England. Ever, with the deepest affection and veneration, your faithful servant, H. Yule." The strength of her older friend and fellow worker, Dr. Sutherland, ebbed rapidly, and he did not long survive his retirement. He died in July 1891. He was in great weakness at the end, and was hardly able to read or to speak, but his wife said that she had received a letter from Miss Nightingale with messages for him. To her surprise, he roused himself once more, read the letter through, and said, "Give her my love and blessing." They were almost his last words. 2. The affectionate sympathy which Miss Nightingale gave to her friends was not lacking to her relations. In 1889, one of the dearest of them, her Aunt Mai, had died at the age of 91. Her husband, the Uncle Sam of earlier chapters, had died 8 years before, and the widow's bereavement seems to have done away with such estrangement as there had been between her and her niece. They resumed their former affectionate correspondence on religious matters, and Miss Nightingale was again the loving Flo of earlier years. "Dearest friend," she wrote on the card sent with flowers when her aunt died, "lovely, loving soul, humble mind of high and holy thought." Miss Nightingale was not one of those persons who keep their tact and kindly consideration for the outside world, and think indolent indifference or rough candour good enough for the family circle. I have been told a little anecdote which is instructive in this connection. Miss Irby came into the Garden Hall at Lea Hurst one day, fresh from an interview with Miss Nightingale. "I must tell you," she said, laughing, to one of Miss Nightingale's younger cousins, "what Florence has just said. It's so like her. She said to me, 'I wonder whether R. remembered to have that branch taken away that fell across the South Drive.' I said, 'I will ask her.' 'Oh no,' said Florence, 'don't ask her that. Ask her whom she asked to take the branch away.' This is only a trifle, but the method of the thing was very characteristic. Miss Nightingale was a diplomatist in small affairs as in great. She was careful not to run a risk of making mischief through intermediaries. She took real trouble to that end, and never seemed to find anything in this sort too much to do. Her influence with every member of her family was used to make relations between them better and more affectionate. With many of the younger generation of her cousins and other kinsfolk she maintained affectionate relations. She regulated her hours very strictly, as we have heard, but she found time, especially in her later years, to see some of these young friends repeatedly. When she did not see them, she liked to be informed of their comings and goings, their doings and prospects, their marriages and belongings. She held in deep affection the memory of Arthur Hugh Clough, and she loved tenderly her cousin, Mr. Shore Smith. She entertained a generous solicitude for Mr. Clough's family, and the family of her cousin Shore were especially close to her. A little note to Mrs. Shore Smith, one of hundreds, illustrates incidentally Miss Nightingale's love of flowers and their insect friends. 10 South Street, April 24, 1894. Dearest, I feel so anxious to know how you are. Thank you so much for your beautiful azaleas, which have come out splendidly, and the yellow tulips. The smell of the azaleas reminds me so of Emilie. On a tulip sat a poor little tiny, pretty little snail, of a sort unknown to me. He said, I was so happy in my garden on my tulip, and I was kidnapped into that horrid box, and whatever am I to do?" So we carried him out and carefully put him among the shrubs in the boxes on the leads, lilacs. But my opinion is that he is very particular about his diet, and that his opinion was that he could find nothing worthy of his acceptance there. He must either have been drowned in the water-spout or dreed the penalty of being particular. Now I return to our brutality in letting you go without even partaking of baby's bottle. My kindest regards to baby and its mamma. Ever your loving F.N. Miss Nightingale was godmother to Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Bonham Carter's son, Malcolm. With Norman, an Indian civilian, a younger son of Mr. Henry Bonham Carter, she kept up a correspondence. She was much attached to Miss Edith Bonham Carter, who had taken up nursing, and there were several other relations who saw her and in whom she was much interested. The number of family letters which she preserved is very large, and among them those relating to the family into which her sister had married are almost as numerous as those relating to her own kith and kin. For Margaret Lady Verney in particular, Miss Nightingale entertained a deep admiration and a most tender affection. She was attached also to Sir Harry's younger son, Mr. Frederick Verney, who in these later years helped her in many of her undertakings, and whom she in turn helped greatly in his. A few of her own family letters, covering a large space of time, will best show the pleasantly affectionate terms, now grave, now gay, on which she placed herself with her relations. To Mrs. Clough, 35 South Street, January 2, 1873. I lit upon the edition of Byron, without Don Juan, which we wished for. There are 2 volumes more than in our edition, which may be trash; but Childe Harold, the descriptions of Greece in the tale, poems, Chillon, but above all, Manfred. There is nothing like it in the world, especially the last scene. The spirit there is really a spirit, the only spirit out of Job and Saul. The ghost in Hamlet is surely a very gross, unpleasant, dead alive, unburied man, with the most vulgar, full-bodied sentiments, clamouring for vengeance on his murderer, not even so spirit-like as a dying man, quite unlike what his son describes him, a thief and impostor, I am sure, going to take the spoons. Manfred, to my mind, stands alone, and is the most spiritual view of immortality, of what hell and heaven really are, of any poetry in the world. One only wonders how Byron ever wrote it. To a niece who was going to college. 10 South Street, August 22, 1881. My very dearest R., Aunt Florence is filled with you and your going to Girton. I can say nothing I would, and saying nothing I would ask those greatest of the heathens, Plato, Aeschylus, Thucydides, to say much to you. Aeschylus, whose Prometheus is evidently a foreshadowing of, or if you like it better, the same type with Osiris of Egypt, as Christ. The one who brought gifts to men, who defied the powers that be, the principalities and powers of evil, who suffered for men in bringing them the best gifts, the fire from heaven, who could only give by suffering himself, and who finally led captivity captive. It seems to me that I see in nothing so much the history of God, in the religions of the world which Monsieur Mohl learnt Oriental languages to write, as in these great heathens, Persian, Chinese, Indian, Greek also, and Latin too, but specially Aeschylus and Plato. And perhaps, too, in physiology, the greatness of his work, the silence of his work, what spirit he is of, his glory and poorness of spirit, and that to be poor of spirit constitutes his glory, if to be poor of spirit means utter unselfishness, perfect freedom from self and from the very thought of self, and from affectations, and from vain glory. My very dearest child, fare you very well, very, very well, is the deepest prayer of Aunt Florence. To a niece who had taken up vegetarianism. 10 South Street, November 8, 1887. Dearest, I send you 2 vegetables in their shells. We shall have some more fresh ones tomorrow. A new potato is, I assure you, not a vegetable. It is a mare's egg laid by her, you know, in a mare's nest. No vegetarian would eat it. I send you some Egyptian lentils. I have them every night for supper, done in milk, which I am not very fond of. The delicious thing is lentil soup, as made every day by an Arab cook in Egypt over a handful of fire not big enough to roast a mosquito. Ever your loving Aunt Florence. To a niece who was full of the cooperative movement. 10 South Street, July 14, 1888. Dearest, your cooperative usefulness is delightful. If it is not in the lowest degree vulgar, I should ask if I might give them some books. But I suppose this is contrary to all cooperative principle. Lady Ashburton has gone to Marienbad to distribute Bibles and tracts in Czechish. There is a very large cooperative estate, about 20 miles distant on the borders of the forest, which she has seen and believes to be entirely successful. And I have charged her to send me home for you details, and of course to prove its success. You see how my manners and principles have been corrupted by you, the youthful prophet. If you observe aberration, do not lay it at my door. It is sad how youth corrupts old age. Your faithful and loving old cooperative, Aunt Florence Nightingale. To Mrs. Vaughan Nash, Claydon House, January 3, 1895. I have never thanked you, except in my heart, which is always, for my beautiful book, Villari's History of Florence, its first 2 centuries. It does look so interesting, and I have always been interested in Florentine history above all others. I think it was from studying Sismondi's République Italienne when I was a young girl, book now despised, you rascal, and from knowing Sismondi himself afterwards at Geneva. The end of this Villari does look so very enthralling, where he traces the causes of the decline and fall of the Florentine Republic, its very wealth and commerce assisting its ruin, and shows how its commune could not develop into a state. That may help some reflections on Indian village communities. But I do not see that he shows, though as I am reading backwards like the devil I may come to it, how different were the Florentine ideas of liberty from ours. With them it was that everybody should have a share in governing everybody else. With us, that everybody should have the power of self-development without hurting anybody else. I remember Villari's Savonarola well. It must have been published 30 or 40 years ago. I always had an enthusiasm for Savonarola. It was heavy, learned, impartial, exhaustive. It was my father's book. He read it much. I think I told you that I possessed copies of the last things that Savonarola ever wrote, commentaries on 2 psalms, not a word against his enemies and persecutions, or any mention of them, or indeed any lamentation at all, but all one long and fervent aspiration after a perfect reunion with the Father of light and love. Good Fenzi, Evelina Galton's husband, had these copies made for me from the originals in the Palazzo Vecchio. To Norman Bonham Carter, 10 South Street, August 2, 1895. You will see by the accounts of the general election how the Conservatives have got in by an enormous majority, and the Liberals are discomfited. But I am an old fogey, and have been at this work for 40 years, and I have always found that the man who has the genius to know how to find details, and the still greater genius of knowing how to apply them, will win, and party does not signify at all. My masters, that is, Sir Robert Peel's school, never cared for place, but always worked for both sides alike. I learned the lesson of life from a little kitten of mine, one of 2. The old cat comes in and says, very cross, I didn't ask you in here. I like to have my missus to myself. And he runs at them. The bigger and handsomer kitten runs away, but the littler one stands her ground, and when the old enemy comes near enough, kisses his nose and makes the peace. That is the lesson of life, to kiss one's enemy's nose, always standing one's ground. I am rather sorry for Lord Salisbury. A majority is always in the wrong. To Louis Shore Nightingale, 10 South Street, December 21, 1896. I have been thinking a great deal of what you said on both sides about a church at Lee. I wish you could consult someone, not churchy like Harry B.C. upon it. What you say, that, if the church is to be done, the proprietors and trustees of Lea Hurst should not set themselves against it, is true. The church is like the Wesleyans, another Christian sect, not to be put down. On the other hand, the church is now more like the scribes and Pharisees than like Christ. The bishops and the high church look upon work among dissenters as work among the heathen. They would upset all the present work in Lee and Holloway if they could. Christ would have laughed at the validity of orders, difficulty of the present day. He would have no dogma. His dogmas were, he tells us distinctly, unselfishness, love to God and our neighbor. He takes the 10 Commandments to pieces and shows us the spirit of them, without which they are nothing, in the Sermon on the Mount. He even ridicules Sabbath observance. What are now called the essential doctrines of the Christian religion he does not even mention. A high churchman, and especially a H.C.H.'s wife, would upset everything. Ever your loving aunt, F. To Norman Bonham Carter, August 27, 1897. I wish you Godspeed, my dear friend. India is a glorious field, provided you keep out of little wars. As you are not a military man, there is just a chance that you may not have perverse views on this subject. I see Charlie sometimes. He is a very good fellow, though a military man. But then his mind is not warped by frontier wars, and I know at Dublin he did a good deal for the men. One of our nurses, Sister Snodgrass, who died just after she had gone out to foreign service, was some years in Dublin military fever wards. She did so much for them, and got many of her orderlies to reform their lives. When they heard of her death, they cried like children. I know how hard worked you are, so am I, but your father helps me with his excellent judgment. God bless you. To Louis Shore Nightingale, 10 South Street, December 23, 1898. I send a small contribution to your journey. I approve of Switzerland, but wish you could prick on to Italy. I always do. If you make a bother about this bit of paper, you will find that, in the words of the immortal Shakespeare, ravens shall pick out your eyes, and eagles eat the same. I have the doctor coming this afternoon, whom I dare not put off, from considerations of the same nature. If you are so good as to come, please come at 5, for only half an hour, that is till 5:30. Multiply such letters largely. Add to them letters of a like kind, mutatis mutandis, addressed to her children in the nursing world. Bring further into count her solicitude for servants and dependents, and it will be seen how faithfully Miss Nightingale followed the words placed at the head of this chapter, words which she had copied out as a New Year's greeting for 1889. She had a soft place in her heart even for criminals who despitefully used her. In July 1892, burglary was committed in her house in South Street. It was in the early morning, and she espied the burglar resting for a moment with his spoils, some of her plate and her maid's money, in a hiding-place behind the house. If her maids or the police or both had been more alert, the malefactor would have been arrested. Her sense for efficiency was outraged, but she relented when the inspector came to see her. "Perhaps it was just as well that you didn't catch the man," she said with a twinkle, "for I am afraid you don't do them much good when you lock them up." She was fond of the police, and during the Jubilee year admired from her window their handling of the crowds. She noted the long hours, made friends with the inspector at Grosvenor Gate, and sent supplies of hot tea and cakes for his men. End of Part 7, Chapter 8. Mr. Jowett and Other Friends. Part 7, Chapter 8 of the Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2 by Edward Tyas Cook. Mr. Jowett and Other Friends continued. 3 and 4. 3. There was a time, as we have heard, when Miss Nightingale's friendship with Mr. Jowett, though it did not diminish, yet became sensible, on her side at least, of a certain discomfort. But that time was short. Later years brought occasion for a renewal of more effective sympathy, and as old age began to steal upon them, the friends held closer together. Mr. Jowett was deeply interested in many of Miss Nightingale's later Indian interests, especially in those that related to education, whether in India itself or of Indians and Indian civil servants in this country. He introduced to her Miss Cornelia Sorabji, whom he befriended at Oxford. He talked and corresponded much with Miss Nightingale about university courses in relation to India. "I want to prove to you," he wrote October 14, 1887, "that your words do sometimes affect my flighty or stony heart, and are not altogether cast to the winds. Therefore I send you the last report of the Indian students, in which you will perceive that agricultural chemistry has become a reality, and that owing to you, though I fear that, like so many other of your good deeds, this will never be known to men, Indian students are reading about agriculture, and that therefore Indian ryots may have a chance of being somewhat better fed than hitherto." When Lord Lansdowne had settled down in India, Mr. Jowett thought that he might without impertinence write to his friend and tell him what he should do to become a really great Viceroy. What should be suggested? Perhaps Miss Nightingale would consider. She took the hint most seriously. The education of Viceroys was a favourite occupation with her. Without disclosing the particular occasion, she took many advisers into council, and discussed with them what reforms might most usefully be introduced. She forwarded her views to Oxford, and they filtered through Mr. Jowett to Simla. Mr. Jowett continued throughout these years to see Miss Nightingale frequently, and generally stayed with her once or twice a year, either in London or at Claydon. In 1887 he was staying in South Street when he was taken ill. Miss Nightingale found him a very wilful patient. He would not take the complete rest which she and the doctor considered essential, and she had to enter into a secret plot with Robert Browning to keep him from the excitement of seeing friends. "I am greatly ashamed," he wrote on his return to Oxford, October 13, "at the trouble and interference to your work which I caused. The recollection of your infinite kindness will never fade from my mind." She sent him elaborate instructions for the better care of his brother ass, the body. "How can I thank you enough for your never-ending kindness to me? May God bless you 1,000 times in your life and in your work. I sometimes think I gossip to you too much. It is due to your kindness and sympathy, and you know that I have no one else to gossip to." From this time forward, Miss Nightingale was constantly solicitous about her friend's health, and entered into regular correspondence with his housekeeper, Miss Knight, who was grateful for being allowed to share her anxieties with so high an authority on matters of health. During Mr. Jowett's illnesses, Miss Nightingale had daily letters or telegrams sent to her reporting the patient's condition in much detail. This was her regular practice in the case of relations or friends for whom she was solicitous. Such bulletins were especially numerous during the fatal illness of her cousin, Miss Hilary Bonham Carter. Miss Nightingale thought, no doubt, that her request for daily particulars would keep the nurses up to the mark, and sometimes it was that she had herself recommended the nurse. There were bulletins of the kind sent to her about Lady Rosebery, whose acquaintance she had made, as already related, in 1882. Lord Rosebery was during some years an occasional caller at South Street. The friendship of Miss Nightingale and Mr. Jowett was to have been commemorated between themselves in an interesting way, for Mr. Jowett desired to contribute towards a scheme which occupied much of Miss Nightingale's time during 1890 and 1891. It was connected with one of the ruling thoughts of her life. She was, as I have said, a passionate statistician. Statistics were to her almost a religious exercise. The true function of theology was to ascertain the character of God. Law was the thought of God. It was by the aid of statistics that law in the social sphere might be ascertained and codified, and certain aspects of the character of God thereby revealed. The study of statistics was thus a religious service. In the sphere of immediate application, she had pointed out 30 years before that there were enormous masses of statistical data already pigeonholed in government offices or easily procurable by government action, of which little or no use was made. Statistics, said Lord Brougham, in a passage already quoted, were to the legislator as the compass or the lead to the navigator, but the actual course of legislation was too often conducted without any such compass or lead at all. The Cabinet Ministers, she now wrote, the army of their subordinates, the Houses of Parliament, have for the most part received a university education, but no education in statistical method. The result was that legislation is not progressive, but see-saw-y. We legislate without knowing what we are doing. The War Office has on some subjects the finest statistics in the world. What comes of them? Little or nothing. Why? Because the heads don't know how to make anything of them, with the two exceptions of Sidney Herbert and W. H. Smith. Our Indian statistics are really better on some subjects than those of England. Of these no use is made in administration. What we want is not so much, or at least not at present, an accumulation of facts as to teach the men who are to govern the country the use of statistical facts. She gave particular instances of the kind of questions which she desired to see thoroughly explored by the statistical method. What had been the result of 20 years of compulsory education? What proportion of children forget all that they learnt at school? What result has the school teaching on the life and conduct of those who do not forget it? Or again, what is the effect of town life on offspring, in number and in health? What are the contributions of the several classes, as to social position and residence, to the population of the next generation? Some of the questions which she hoped to see solved by the statistical method came near to those with which a later generation is familiar under the name of eugenics. Her friend, M. Quetelet, had made a beginning in the science of social physics. Both he and Dr. Farr had hoped that she would carry on the work. She had often talked with Mr. Jowett on the subject, and now a scheme was suggested. She would give a sum of money, and he a like amount, and between them they would found at Oxford a professorship or lectureship in applied statistics. They agreed first to consult various friends and experts. Mr. Jowett seems to have discussed the matter with Mr. Arthur Balfour and Professor Alfred Marshall. Of Mr. Balfour he wrote, December 4, 1890, that he has more head and power of thinking than any statesman whom I have ever known. Miss Nightingale, on her side, called into council Mr. Francis Galton, who took up the idea warmly and elaborated a detailed scheme. He raised, however, a preliminary objection. A professor at Oxford or Cambridge of any subject which is not a principal element in an examination school is a professor without a class, and often sinks into somnolence. He suggested that the professorship would be more useful if attached to the Royal Institution. Mr. Jowett, who had perhaps entered into the scheme from interest rather in Miss Nightingale than in the subject, was not very helpful in matters of detail, but he was ready to acquiesce in any scheme which Miss Nightingale adopted. He made only two conditions: first, that he should be allowed to contribute, and next, that the professorship should be called by her name. Mr. Galton went on with his plans, which, as they were developed, were found to require a very large sum of money. Miss Nightingale, whose resources were in great part tied up by settlements, consulted her trustees. They did not deny that she could put down £4,000, the sum which Mr. Galton's scheme seemed to require as her contribution, but they were not passionate statisticians, and did not underrate the objections to such a gift. Meanwhile, time was passing. Mr. Galton was busy with other things, and Miss Nightingale herself, being much occupied during this year, 1891, with other affairs, laid the scheme aside. Mr. Jowett, moreover, was very ill in the same year, having a serious heart attack, from which he barely recovered, and which was premonitory of the end. At the beginning of October he spent a few days at Claydon with Sir Harry Verney and Miss Nightingale. On returning to Oxford he was worse. "You will be tired of hearing from me," he said to her in a dictated letter of farewell (Oct. 16), "and I begin to think that I may as well cease. Many interesting things have been revealed to me in my illness, of which I should like to talk to you. I never had an idea of what death was, or of what the human body was before, and am very far from knowing now. I am always thankful for having known you. I try to go on to the end as I was. I hope you will do so too. It is best. I hope that you may continue many years, and that you may do endless kindnesses to others. Will you cast a look sometimes on my old friends, Miss Knight and Mrs. T. H. Green, and my two young friends, F. and J.? It would please me if you could say a word to them from time to time. But perhaps it is rather drivelling to try and make things permanent which are already passing away. Ever yours affectionately, B.J." He thought that he was on the point of death, and in a will made at this time he bequeathed £2,000 to Miss Nightingale for certain purposes. It was the sum which he had meant to contribute to the Nightingale Professorship of Statistics. He rallied, however, and begged her to do as she had offered, and come over from Claydon to see him. "I am delighted to hear," he wrote November 18, "that you will do me the honour to come to Balliol to see me. Ackland will send his carriage for you to the station. It will be a great event for me to have a visit from you." Mr. Jowett was spared for nearly 2 years, and he still came from time to see her. "I want to hold fast to you, dear friend," he wrote May 26, 1892, "as I go down the hill. You and I are agreed that the last years of life are in a sense the best, and that the most may be made of them even at a time when health and strength may seem to be failing." In August 1893 Mr. Jowett was again very ill. He dictated a letter to Miss Nightingale, commending some of his friends to her once more. He rallied a little, and came up to London to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Campbell. On September 18 he dictated his last letter to Miss Nightingale. "We called upon you yesterday in South Street, but finding no one at home, supposed you had migrated to Claydon. Fare you well. How greatly am I indebted to you for all your affection! How large a part has your life been of my life! There is only time, I think, for a few words. On October 1 he died at the house of Mr. Justice Wright in Hampshire, to which he had gone a few days before." "Do you know," wrote Miss Nightingale to Mrs. Clough, November 7, "that he sometimes felt glad in the society of Clough during his last illness? He was in London at the house of those dear Lewis Campbells for doctoring and nursing from September 16 to 23rd. He was lying in the way he liked, silent, with Mr. Lewis Campbell sitting beside him, when suddenly he opened his eyes and said, 'Oh, is it you? I thought it was Clough.'" Pinned to Miss Nightingale's letter there is one which Mr. Jowett had written 32 years before to Mrs. Clough on the death of his friend, her husband. In it he had said, "I loved him and think of him daily. I should like to have the memory of him, and also of Miss Nightingale, present with me in death, as of the two persons whose example I value most, as having walked by faith." Miss Nightingale had other bereavements at this time. "I have lost," she wrote, "the 3 nearest to me in 12 months, 1893 94. In February 1894 Sir Harry Verney died, and she felt the loss of his courage, his courtesy, his kindness. In August her cousin, Mr. Shore Smith, died, her boy of the old days, whom throughout his life she had regarded with something of a mother's love, nor had she ever forgotten the fond and dutiful affection which he had shown towards her own mother. Miss Nightingale felt the three losses deeply, but a note of serenity marked her old age. "This is a sad birthday, dearest," she wrote a little later, "but let me send a few roses to say what words cannot say. There is so much to live for. I have lost much in failures and disappointment, as well as in grief. But do you know, life is more precious to me now in my old age." The place left vacant by Mr. Jowett's death was in some respects filled henceforth by the Rev. Thory Gage Gardiner, who from time to time administered the sacrament to Miss Nightingale in her room, and in whose work in South London she came to take a lively interest. The professorship which Mr. Jowett and Miss Nightingale were to have founded was never realized. Miss Nightingale had laid the scheme aside at the end of 1891 with a sore heart, she said, for it had been an object of a lifetime. Mr. Jowett, knowing that she had abandoned the scheme, had omitted his bequest in a new will made during his last illness. But when 3 years later she in turn came to make her will, she still had the scheme in mind. It was a trust, she used to say, committed to her by Monsieur Quetelet and Dr. Farr, and it was connected with memories of Mr. Jowett. She gave accordingly to Francis Galton £2,000 for certain purposes, and declared that the same shall be paid in priority to all other bequests given by her will for charitable and other purposes. Her hope was that the £2,000 would suffice for some educational work in the use of statistics. But Mr. Galton differed, and in the following year she revoked the bequest by codicil. A pencilled note found among her papers gives the reason. "I recall or revoke the legacy of £2,000 to Mr. Francis Galton, because he does not think it sufficient for the purpose I wished, and proposes a small endowment for research, which I believe will only end in endowing some bacillus or microbe, and I do not wish that." 4. Miss Nightingale's life, said Mr. Jowett, had been a large part of his. That his life had also been a large part of hers, this memoir will have shown. Few men or women had known him so well, and into the inscription which she sent with her flowers she distilled her memories. In loving remembrance of Professor Jowett, the genius of friendship, above all the friend of God. Among the many letters which she received about his death, none touched or interested her so much as those of Lord Lansdowne. Simla, October 11. Our dear old friend is, as far as his bodily presence in our midst is concerned, lost to us. It is a real sorrow to me. I had no more constant friend, and I cannot express the gratitude with which I look back to his unfailing interest in all that befell me, and to his help and guidance at times when they were most needed. His saying that he meant to get better because he had yet so much to do is touching and characteristic. He was one who would never have sat down and said that his task was done, or that he was entitled to rest from toil for the remainder of his days. It would, however, be very far from the truth to think that his work was at an end because he is no longer here to carry it on with his own hands. Simla, October 25. Of all the true and appreciative words which you have written of him, none seem to me truer than those in which you speak almost impatiently of the shallow fools who thought that he had no religion. His religion always seemed to me nearer to that which the Master taught his followers than that of any other man or woman whom I have met, and I doubt whether any one of our time has done so much to spread true religion and Christianity in the best sense of the word. All this was precisely and profoundly what Miss Nightingale felt about her friend. Of all men whom she had known, none seemed to her to have led a Christian life more consistently than Mr. Jowett. In her thoughts about him she had only one regret. It was that their friendship had never resulted in any formal restatement of religious doctrine. She had not been able to put into any such form as satisfied him the scheme of theodicy which they had discussed during 30 years, and he had devoted too much time, she thought, to criticism and too little to reconstruction. But in religious practice, how rich was his legacy, both in precept and in example! In letters of his later years, no thought had been more often expressed by Mr. Jowett than that of Browning's Rabbi Ben Ezra, a poem which he was constantly recommending to Miss Nightingale. And there was another poem which he sent her, the Song Celestial, translated from the Mahabharata by Sir Edwin Arnold. I think, he wrote, November 6, 1886, it expresses some of the deepest thoughts of the human heart. These two poems, which Miss Nightingale read, marked, and learnt, were to set the note of her last years. End of Mr. Jowett and Other Friends, continued, sections 3 and 4.
Chapter 9 of The Life of Florence Nightingale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Florence Nightingale by Sir Edward Coke. Chapter 9. Old Age to Death, 1894 to 1910. The truer, the safer, the better years of life are the later ones. We must find new ways of using them, doing not so much, but in a better manner, economizing because economy has become necessary, for bodily strength obviously grows less. That is the will of God, and cannot be escaped or denied. Benjamin Jowett, Letter to Miss Nightingale, December 30th, 1887. Let fruits of labour go, renouncing hope for me, with lowliest heart, so shalt thou come, for though to know is more than diligence, yet worship better is than knowing, and renouncing better still. Near to renunciation, very near, dwelleth eternal peace. Sir Edwin Arnold, The Song Celestial. It was in the spirit of Rabbi Ben Ezra that Miss Nightingale faced old age, and for a few years after she had passed her 75th birthday, she was able to enjoy the last of life with full zest. Something of her former vigor was lost, but something of tenderness and acquiescence was gained. Then her powers gradually failed. She was still in this world, but hardly any longer of it. The time for renunciation was come. There were several years of pensive evening, and then the end, or as Miss Nightingale believed with passionate intensity, the beginning of new work in another world. In her later years, a young cousin, in speaking to her of the death of a relation whom they both loved, said that now at any rate he was at rest and in peace. Miss Nightingale, who had been lying back on her pillows, sat up on the instant and said with full fire and vigor, "Oh no, I am sure it is an immense activity." Miss Nightingale's fervour in preaching the gospel that a man's latter years should be his best appears in a series of letters which touch successively on three of the main interests of her life. The first is to the cousin, who now for 35 years had been her right-hand man in all that concerned the Nightingale School. The second is to a politician with whose aspirations for a new era in India she had sympathized. And the third, to her old comrade in the British Army. To Henry Bonham Carter, 10th South Street, March 4th, 1894. My dear Harry, Florence Nightingale did not know or did not remember, more abominable me, that your birthday, a day we must all bless, was on February 15th. And don't say alas when you say it completes my 67th year. Your son is still in the meridian, thank God. Mr. Jowett always said that the last years of life were and ought to be the best. And of himself he said, though he had, I fear, plenty of suffering in the last 2 years, and some ingratitude among those whom he had really created, that these years were his happiest. His energy never flagged. Sir Harry, an extraordinarily different man, has often told me that the last 2 or 3 were the happiest. And his energy, fitful as it always was, never flagged till the very last week of his life. Sidney Herbert worked till his last fortnight. And Mr. Gladstone, for this is like his death, will be lamented not because he worked at Home Rule to his last moment, but because to his last moment he maintained the House of Commons at what it was in the years I so well remember, its palmy days under the school of Sir Robert Peel, of whom he is the last. Now haven't we cause to rejoice in your life ever more and more every year, and to thank you more and more, and to sing not the Dies Irae, but the Te Deum for your life? And a great many more besides us. Hoot hoot, laddie! You are one of those who open the kingdom of heaven, that which is within and here, to all believers, and not one of those who leap from a pinnacle of the temple knowing nothing, but just thinking that the angels will bear them up. Like some I could name, but refrain. And one at least of the angels is always a vulgar wretch. And the real angels who are working hard, and in detail entirely repudiate the bearing up of the leaper from the pinnacle. Believe me, ever yours, gratefully and affectionately, Florence Nightingale. To Sir William Wedderburn, 10th South Street, August 13th, 1896. You have no business to be low-spirited about the future. There is Providence still. It is 40 years this month since I came back from the Crimea. See how poor I have been helped, though I have lost all my friends among ministers. When I am low-spirited, I read about the Duke of Wellington in the Battle of Waterloo or the Peninsular War. And I see how he held on. Alone he did it. And what was the end? He saved Europe. So it will be with you. You will save India. To the Crimean Veterans, October 25th, 1897. My dear old comrades, I think of you on Balaclava Day and many days besides. In peace as in war, I wish you the best wish. Quit ye like men. God, from whom the soldiers take their orders, has as much work for us to do for him in peace as in war. Thank his love and wisdom. And to the last years of our lives, which ought to be the best years of our lives. Never say poor lives. Life is a splendid gift if we will but let him make it so. Here and hereafter, for himself. God bless you all. A few weeks before the date of her letter to the Crimean veterans, she had thanked God in her meditations for all he had given her. Work, constant work. Work with Sidney Herbert, work with Lord Lawrence, and never out of work still. I am soaked in work, she wrote to Sir Douglas Galton, January 1897. You see, she said to Mr. Bonham Carter, September 1895, I have my hands full, and am not idle, though people naturally think that I have gone to sleep or am dead. Once or twice her death had been reported. On another occasion, a paragraph went the round of the religious press stating that Miss Nightingale, having contracted a spinal complaint from her long hours of standing in the Crimea, had now for some years been an inpatient at St. Thomas's Hospital. The paragraph brought a sheaf of letters from persons with sure remedies for spinal disease, from faith healers, from mothers who had daughters similarly affected, and to the hospital many flowers and letters of consolation. They know nothing, she wrote to Mr. Bonham Carter, July 6, 1897, of what a press my life is, and often a hopeless press but for you. It was a busy life, and until near its end it was less subject to ill health than in earlier years. Part 2. All the active interests of her life still occupied her. She interested herself closely in the progress of sanitary reform in India, and it was not till 1906 that her secretary had to inform the India office that sanitary papers could no longer usefully be forwarded to her. Lord Elgin, who succeeded Lord Lansdowne as Viceroy in 1894, had sent his private secretary, Sir Henry Babington Smith, to call upon her, and through him she had still corresponded with the Governor-General. Her days of vigorous campaigning were over. She became more reconciled as she grew older to those periods of Indian cosmogony of which Lord Salisbury, in the years of her impatience, had reminded her. She realized more fully than before that in India the progress of sanitary education must be slow. In 1898 she received the Aga Khan. A most interesting man, she said in her note of the interview, but you can never teach him sanitation. I never understood before how really impossible it is for an Eastern to care for material things. I told him as well as I could differences both in town and in country during my life. Do you think you are improving? He asked. By improving he meant believing more in God. To him, sanitation is unreal and superstitious. Religion, spirituality, is the only real thing. And besides, Miss Nightingale had now to accept limitations in what she could any longer hope to effect. These limitations, and the work within them, which she was still able to do, are touched upon in a piece from her pen in 1896. I am painfully aware how difficult, how almost impossible it is for anyone at a great distance to do anything to help forward a movement requiring unremitting labor and supervision on the spot. But it is my privilege to meet in England from time to time Indian friends who are heartily desirous of obtaining for their poor fellow countrymen the benefits which, through sanitary science, are gradually being extended to the masses here, both in town and country, and which are doing so much to promote their health and happiness. so I never lose an opportunity of urging a practical beginning, however small, for it is wonderful how often in such matters the mustard seed germinates and roots itself." And she went on to describe the steps which her friend Mr. Malabari was taking to promote sanitary education, and even to institute health missionaries in selected districts of rural India. The government of India was cooperating to some extent in such work. In a paper written in 1894, she tendered cordial acknowledgments to Lord Cross, Lord Lansdowne, and Lord Elgin, the viceroys, for the personal interest they have shown in the matter of village sanitation. She especially commended the practical and helpful spirit shown in the Government of India's dispatch of March 1895 instituting village sanitary inspection books. Part 3. In the army, too, Miss Nightingale continued to take a lively interest, and Sir Douglas Galton was still within, not always instant, call to give her information or advice. Miss Nightingale to Sir Douglas Galton, 10th South Street, November 24th, 1895. "Oh, you Turk! Oh, you rascal! Sir Douglas, not to tell me that you were in London, not to reward me for my good resolution in not troubling you. I would have asked but few questions, but these called for haste. 1. Most important, how the troops for Kumassi are to be supplied with water, day and night, fit to drink? Spirit ration only as medicine? Are they to have salt pork and beef? Then about their shoes, stockings, and boots. Are these things now recognized at headquarters? Probably I am disquieting myself in vain. Lord Lansdowne is so overwhelmed with amateur schemes for W.O. reform. Not that I am in that line of business now at all, but I do not like to write to him just now. Number 2. Barracks at Newcastle on Tyne, depot where the 5th Fusiliers are quartered. Said to be in an awful state of bad drainage. Not denied, but remedy would cost too much. I know nothing of it personally. Ladies' Sanitary Association dying to interfere. Sir Thomas Crawford dead, or I should have asked his advice. Number 3. We have another nurse, a sister of St. Thomas's, going out to India to join the army nursing staff. 3 are going out in 3 ships. They don't know where. Each goes alone. The I.O. sends them out like the famous pair of painted marmots who came over in 3 ships, on the crust of a 2-penny loaf which served them for provisions during the voyage. Mine asked me for an army medical book. Don't misunderstand. The nurses must not know anything about anything to be looked well on by the doctors, whose treatment is, I believe, what it was 40 years ago. But if there is a book which could put her up to things, not accepting the terrible increase of the vicious disease, do recommend it me if you can. In 1895 came the reluctant retirement of the Duke of Cambridge from the post of Commander-in-Chief which he had held for nearly 50 years, and Sir Douglas suggested to Miss Nightingale that the old soldier might be pleased by a letter from her. I should never have thought that myself, she said, but she had a soft place in her heart for the Duke, as we have seen, and she took kindly to the suggestion. She sent a sympathetic letter, in which, as an old servant of the soldiers herself, she ventured to thank the Duke for his many services to the British Army. I have had such a very nice answer, she told Sir Douglas. The terms in which the Duke replied, October 1st, show that Miss Nightingale's kindly compliments had brought some balm to him in his great grief and sorrow. One of Miss Nightingale's latest interventions in administrative affairs was an urgent plea for improvement in the barracks of Hong Kong, about which she had received private information in connection with the outbreak of bubonic plague in 1896. She prepared a careful summary of the case, and through Sir Douglas Galton made representations both to the War Office, Sir Evelyn Wood, and to the Colonial Office, Mr. Chamberlain. Sir Evelyn Wood, I feel sure, must at any rate have listened attentively to what she had to say. In 1898, he gave an appointment to a godson of hers, and told her with what pleasure he had done so as a patient of yours in 1856. As for the Colonial Office, she noted a wise saw which someone told her. If you get a private reply, the thing is done. If an official reply, all is up. Her reply was official, but nevertheless something was done, though not, I think, all that she wanted. Another matter which much occupied Miss Nightingale's mind at the time was the effect of the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act, especially in connection with India. In 1896-97, a departmental committee was appointed to report upon the facts, and there was much discussion. Miss Nightingale was besieged by both sides for her opinion. She had found reason in the facts for some modification of her former opinions. She was still opposed to the complete reintroduction of the old system, but she thought, on close examination of the facts, that the balance of advantage, moral and physical, lay with some amount of sanitary precaution. She signed, with a reservation, a memorial promoted by Princess Christian, Lady June, and the others, expressing our anxious hopes that effectual measures will be taken to check the spread of contagious diseases among our soldiers, especially in India. There was much abuse of Miss Nightingale, and some praying over her for such backsliding. It was in connection with this matter that she wrote a characteristic comment upon one of her friends. She does not want to hear the facts. She wants to be enthusiastic. Study of the facts, forethought, good administration. These were the things which constantly occupied Miss Nightingale's mind in relation to military, as to other affairs. They were the things which had been indelibly impressed upon her by the Crimean War. In the year of the Diamond Jubilee, the enterprising Mr. Kiralfy bethought himself of a Victorian-era exhibition, in which one section should be devoted to nursing. Great ladies took up the idea, and Miss Nightingale was besieged from many quarters to let herself be represented by photographs, busts, autographs, and relics of the Crimean War. Miss Nightingale at the first attack was in her most withering vein. "Oh, the absurdity of people," she wrote, "and the vulgarity. The relics, the representations of the Crimean War. What are they? They are, first, the tremendous lessons we have had to learn from its tremendous blunders and ignorances. And next they are the trained nurses and the progress of hygiene. These are the representatives of the Crimean War. And I will not give my foolish portrait, which I have not got, or anything else as relics of the Crimea. It is too ridiculous. You don't judge even of the victuals inside a public house by the sound outside. I won't be made a sign at an exhibition. Think of Sidney Herbert's splendid royal commissions which struck the keynote of progress in the British Army. Think of the unwearied toil of the sanitarians. And you ask me for the photograph of a rat, and at the moment, too, when there is the plague at Bombay." But having delivered her mind in some letters to this effect, Miss Nightingale let her heart be persuaded. Lady Wantage, whom she held in affectionate admiration, climbed the stairs in South Street to press the suit in person, and Miss Nightingale surrendered. Lady Wantage was so charming, she wrote, half ashamed of the surrender, and she wouldn't take when I went off upon the royal commissions et e genus omne, and she struck to her point, and she was so gracious, and she is such a very good woman. So the bust of Florence Nightingale was lent, and her old Crimean carriage, brought down from a loft in the country, was patched up to serve as a relic. A distinguished writer, but he was a humorist, has averred that he once saw an Italian organ grinder on his knees before a shop window in St. Martin's Lane, having taken a dentist's showcase for relics of the saints. That was perhaps pushing things a little too far, but hope in the hem of the garment is deeply rooted in men's hearts. "We want something to love," said one of Miss Nightingale's friends in supporting Lady Wantage's petition, "and one cannot love royal commissions." The Crimean relic served. At the exhibition, an old soldier was seen to go up to the carriage and kiss it. The bust was also bedecked. "Now I must ask you," wrote Miss Nightingale to her cousin Louis, October 16, 1897, when the exhibition was to be closed, about my bust. Here I stop to utter a great many bad words not fit to put on paper. I also utter a pious wish that the bust may be smashed. I should not have remembered it, but that I am told somebody came every day to dress it with fresh flowers. I utter a pious wish that that person may be saved. You, for I know not what sins, it appears, are my man of business. What is to be done about that bust?" Miss Nightingale's private meditations were the more earnest for her compliance in what she regarded as a mere triviality. The exhibition was to her an occasion for giving thanks to God. How inefficient I was in the Crimea, yet He has raised up trained nursing from it. Memories of the Crimea were much in Miss Nightingale's mind during these years. On Waterloo Day, 1898, she made an interesting note. "What an administrator was the Duke! He chose the ground for the battle, he, not the enemy. By his constructive arrangements having forced them to accept the ground he chose, he, who had no staff fit to help him, supervised everything himself. He made each corps lie down on the ground he had chosen for it the next day. The ammunition each would require was conveyed to it under his own orders. How many a battle has been lost from want of ammunition! He provided for every possible contingency. Nothing was neglected, nothing lost, nothing failed. and so he delivered Europe from the greatest military genius the world has ever seen. How different was the Duke from Lord Raglan, excepting that both were honourable gentlemen. Lord Raglan was told in a letter by a chance doctor, a volunteer, a civilian, a man whom nobody had ever heard of, that if the men were not better hutted, better fed, better clothed, in a few weeks he would have no army at all. Lord Raglan rode down at once alone with the exception of a single orderly, and got off his horse and went into his informant's tent and said, "You know, I could try you by court-martial for this letter." He answered, "My lord, that is just what I want. Then the truth will come out. What signifies what becomes of me? But will you ride round first alone just as you are now at once and see whether what I have said is true?" Lord Raglan did so, and found that it was within the truth. And so the army was saved. The men were dying of scurvy from salt meat, but the shores of the Euxine were crowded with cattle. The outbreak of war in South Africa led her thoughts to another interest which had much occupied her at Scutari: the better employment of the soldier in peace. "London is full," she noted, October 1899, "of rumours of war with the Boers. I cannot say that these rumours are frightful in my ears. Few men and fewer women have seen so much of the horrors of war as I have. Yet I cannot say that war seems to me an unmitigated evil. The soldier in war is a man, devoted to his duty, giving his life for his comrade, his country, his God. I cannot bear to say, compare him with a soldier in peace in barracks. For you will say, then would you have always war? Well, I have nothing to do with the making of war or peace. I can only say that you must see the man in war to know what he is capable of. If you drive past a barrack, you will see 2 heads idling and lolling out of every window. And the only creature who is doing anything is the dog who is carrying victuals to his wife who has puppies. And the moral is, provide the soldier with active employment." End of Part 7, Chapter 9, Old Age to Death.
Part 7, Chapter 9 of The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2, by Edward Tyas Cook. Old Age, Death, continued, 4, 5, 6, 7. 4. She was unable to take any active part in connection with sending out nurses to South Africa, though many inquiries were addressed to her, and many nurses wrote to her from the scene of war. To the Scottish Hospital in South Africa she contributed £100, a gift which was partly inspired by affection for her grateful and loving child, Miss Spencer, matron of the Edinburgh Infirmary, who was much interested in the scheme. Miss Nightingale's interest in the work of her old pupils all over the country, in the education of her probationers at St. Thomas's, and in the affairs of the nursing world in general, was unabated during the closing years of the century. The nurses' battle about registration was still active, and from time to time she was appealed to for aid. In 1895 certain overtures were made. "Shall I royally discard it?" she asked, "or give them a buster?" She chose the latter course. A little later, one of her allies was thought to be weakening. "I did my spiriting," she reported, "with that gentleness for which I am so remarkable. He gives in. He is a very striking man, and of great presence of mind, masterful too, but he is staggered by princesses." She was hard at work, too, with advising on appointments. There was one part of the world, however, Buenos Ayres, of which Miss Nightingale began to wash her hands. Of the last party, all were married within a year. What is the use of sending out any more? At home there were 4 successors wanted, she wrote 1896, and 4 staffs howling. A matron in a country hospital was about to resign. I had 2 letters and 4 telegrams from her on Tuesday, and other days in proportion. The volume of her nursing correspondence during 1896 to 97 is indeed as great as at any previous time, and she still received regular visits from matrons, sisters, and nurses. After looking over a mass of Sisters' records, probationers' examination papers, case books, and diaries, and having had the pleasure of many afternoons with probationers and ex-probationers, she found much cause for thankfulness in her school. But as we are always trying to make progress, she went on to propose to her council a series of detailed suggestions for reform. For some years, too, she was much occupied in advising Lord and Lady Monteagle in a matter which they were promoting, the training of nurses for Irish workhouses. Her affectionate concern in her nursing friends was constant. In the year of the Jubilee, 1897, Queen Victoria invited her to come in a bath chair to the forecourt of Buckingham Palace to witness the procession. She was unable to leave her room, but she remembered the nurses and purchased a number of seats for distribution among them. She was deeply interested in a nurse who volunteered for plague service in India. The deepest, quietest, most striking person I have seen from our present staff, and so pretty, not enthusiastic except in the good old original sense, God in us. She is firmly and cautiously determined to go to the plague. After a series of interviews with nurses and letters from them, 1898, Miss Nightingale noted some impressions of types. She valued efficiency, but she deplored a tendency which she detected to substitute professionalism for heart. Who are the ministering angels? She asked. The angels are not they who go about scattering flowers. Any naughty child would like to do that, even any rascal. The angels are they who, like nurse or ward maid or scavenger, do disgusting work, removing injury to health or obstacles to recovery, emptying slops, washing patients, etc., for all of which they receive no thanks. These are the angels. They speak kind words to and give sympathy. The drabby nurse, crying as if her heart would break, with apron over her head, because a poor little peevish thing who has never given her anything but trouble is dead, is an angel, while the nurse who coolly walks down a ward, noting how many children are dead who were alive when she last made her round, is by no means an angel. In such thoughts, Miss Nightingale had a constant sympathizer in the Grand Duchess of Baden, who wrote to her year by year in terms of warm affection, reporting progress in German nursing, reports which told of professional improvement, but also, as the Grand Duchess thought, of some lack of high ideal. The Empress Frederick, too, continued to see Miss Nightingale from year to year, and their talk was very sympathetic. Of her allies at home, Mr. Bonham Carter was helpful, not only in the conduct of the Nightingale School, but in the management of her private affairs. Mr. Rathbone retained to the last his devotion to her as the founder of modern nursing. "To have been allowed," he wrote December 27, 1897, "to work with your inspiration and wise counsels for more than 35 years as one of your agents in your great work is a thing I am deeply grateful for. I remain while life lasts your devoted friend, and in effort at least your faithful servant." From the confinement of your room, he added, "you have done more to spread reform than you could have done with the most perfect health and strength." That was not the opinion of Miss Nightingale. She could only direct or advise. She had for many years been forced to leave action to others. The sense of this disability did not grow less, but as years passed it was felt to be the common lot of the old. She was not well pleased with all that she saw, but she was, of necessity and by discipline of character, less impatient. She could now regard with affectionate tolerance a wedding in her family of nurses. To one child she sent a present, with the very best marriage wishes of F.N. "Though sorry to lose you, come and see me." She even forgave an old friend whose marriage many years before she had resented as desertion. She saw much around her to criticize, but she was content to uphold her own ideals, and her criticisms became less censorious. "Remember," she said to herself in her meditations, "God is not my private secretary." As old friends disappeared, she looked the more earnestly to the younger generation. Sir Robert Rawlinson, who for more than 40 years had corresponded with her on sanitary affairs, died in 1898. Sir Douglas Galton in 1899, Mr. Rathbone in 1902. She was anxious that Sir Douglas Galton's services should be rightly appreciated in the press, and took some measures to that end. "The man whom we have lost," she wrote privately, March 12, 1899, Sir Douglas Galton, "was the first Royal Engineer who put any sanitary work into our engineering. The head of these men at the War Office, the R. Engineers, himself said to me, 'Our business is to make roads and to build bridges. We have nothing to do with health and that kind of doctor's work,' or words to that effect. Sir D.G. opened his own ears and his heart and his mind, and put all his powers into saving life while working in his profession. One does feel," she had written on All Souls' Day, 1896, "the passing away of so many who seemed essential to the world. I have no one now to whom I could speak of those who are gone. But all the more I am eager to see successors. What is that verse, that the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons and daughters of God? And I am thankful for the many noble souls I have known." 5. Gradually Miss Nightingale's powers failed. For the last 15 years of her life she seldom left her room in South Street. Her last visit to Hembley had been in August 1891. The property there was sold in 1896, "and I don't like being turned out of Hampshire," she said. Her last visit to Claydon was in 1894–95. To Lea Hurst, which had been let for 10 years in 1883, she never went after her mother's death, though she retained her interest in local affairs there to the end. Already in 1887 she had talked of herself as almost blind, and in 1895, in a note of symptoms about which to ask her doctor, she had included want of memory. The loss at first was only of dates and names, but after a few years it became more general. Her eyesight, which had troubled her for some time, now failed. The long series of pencilled meditations ceased. In the later years of them, though there was still much self-condemnation, there was more of peace and hope. November 3–4, 1893. 39 years ago, arrival at Scutari. The immense blessings I have had, the longings of my heart accomplished, and now drawn to thee by difficulties and disappointments. Homeward bound, I have entered in. Owing to her eyesight being the first among her powers to fail, there is one exception to the general statement that the failure was gradual. Her power of writing failed all at once. Miss Nightingale's handwriting, of which a facsimile has already been given, was very characteristic, clear, bold, and careful. She was possessed with the idea of doing everything that she undertook as perfectly as pains could enable her. In her handwriting every letter is well formed, every word has its clear space, paragraphs, insets, and intervals are arranged carefully to help the reader to the sense. Yet all is done with an air of freedom and distinction. There is an artistic feeling about the script. The distinctive formation of the F in her signature may be instanced. Few persons, I imagine, have ever written so much as Miss Nightingale did with her own hand, and the writing never deteriorated. Some of her best friends and helpers, Sidney Herbert, for instance, and Douglas Galton, wrote, when hurried, the worst hands, and she would often pencil over their almost indecipherable scrawls a fair copy of what she conjectured the words to be. Many of her own letters were in pencil, for she wrote much in bed, but she used a particular brand, procured by her friend Mr. Frederick of the War Office, hard and not easily delible, and her handwriting is as good in pencil as with the pen. There were some variations in its manner. In middle life, as some one said of it, her writing galloped across the page, tossing its mane. In youth and in age it was extremely careful. The very latest examples which I have seen show only a slight quaver in the lines. The formation of the letters and the spacing are as exact as ever. Then the sight failed, and the writing almost ceased. From about 1901 or 1902 onwards, she could neither read nor write except with the greatest difficulty. There were no longer papers on the bed, the hands were quiet, her eyes rested on her friends with even more than the old kindness, but not with the old penetrating clearness. In 1902, Miss Nightingale was persuaded to accept the services of a companion, Miss Cochrane, who, on leaving to be married, was succeeded in 1904 by Miss Elizabeth Bosanquet. Some diplomacy was necessary, and at first it was agreed that the post should be called that of lady housekeeper. In reality, it was that of private secretary with large initiative. Miss Nightingale did not easily yield to her infirmities. She concealed them, too, so cleverly as sometimes to mislead visitors, who took a kindly "Yes, dear," to express more intellectual apprehension and assent than really lay behind it. Lord Kitchener, who paid her a visit, remarked to Miss Cochrane after the interview how closely Miss Nightingale in her old age followed what was going on. But she had known that Lord Kitchener was coming, and had prepared herself by questioning Miss Cochrane fully and impressing on her own memory what her visitor had lately been doing. For some years she liked to feel that she was still in the movement of the world, and to have the daily newspaper read to her, thus submitting in old age to an exercise which had caused her much impatient disgust in youth. Her Notes on Nursing, written nearly half a century before, proved true in some respects of her own case, though not in others. She was indifferent to some of her maxims, and in the last years paid little attention to the gospel of the open window. But what she had observed in sick rooms about the tastes of others was recognized as true by those in attendance upon her. So long as she could see it all, she greatly loved to have flowers about her. Then again, she had written that what those like who are past the power of action themselves is to hear of good practical action by others. And that was what she found in her old age. She liked to have biographies read to her, and essays which recounted or commended vigorous doing. She was never tired of some pages in Mr. Roosevelt's strenuous life, and would signify approval by rapping energetically on the table beside her. For several years her bodily strength was well maintained, and she suffered little except from occasional rheumatism. She was rather a difficult patient, for she could not bring herself to believe that she needed care. She did not take kindly to the introduction of a nurse. The ruling passion of her life was strong, and when the nurse had tucked her up for the night, she would often reverse the parts, get out of bed, and go into the adjoining room to tuck up the nurse. She could not realize that her secretary lived with her night and day, and when good night was said, she would reply, "And now, my dear, how are you going home? Do let me send for a cab." Her voice still retained its quality. In extreme old age she used to recite Milton and Shelley, and pieces of Italian and French, in rich, full tones. Sometimes she would sing, still in a sweet and gay voice, a snatch of an Italian song. Her voice seemed, says one who was much with her, to fill the room. One day, says a cousin, she was objecting to being helped in dressing, and I was summoned from the bottom to the top of the house by splendid easy shouts. But there was only occasional revolt. The abiding impression made upon all who served her was of an unfailing kindness and consideration. She still received many visitors, in addition to her cousins and other kinsfolk. Among old friends, Miss Paulina Irby saw her the most frequently. Sometimes the visit was from a stranger, to whom the occasion had almost an hieratic impressiveness. Miss Nightingale liked best those visitors who had an abundant flow of vigorous talk. A pause in the conversation, which she might be expected to fill by starting a new topic, was a strain to her. The visits which tired her least were those of matrons and nursing sisters. She loved to hear of their work, their patients, and especially of suggestions they made for improvements. One of her nursing friends paused in the talk to ask, "But am I not tiring you?" "Oh, no," replied Miss Nightingale quickly. "You give me new life." To dictate any message on her own part was now beyond her. Of the messages sent to her, those which she longest retained the power of apprehending were from Crimean veterans. 6. Memory, sight, and mental apprehension were rapidly failing when the crowning honours of her life, as the world counts them, were conferred upon her. On November 28, 1907, King Edward wrote with much pleasure to offer the Order of Merit in recognition of invaluable services to the country and to humanity. A suitable reply was framed for her, and on December 5, Sir Douglas Dawson, on the King's behalf, brought the order, then for the first time bestowed upon a woman, to South Street. Miss Nightingale understood that some kindness had been done to her, but hardly more. Too kind, she said. On March 16, 1908, the freedom of the City of London was conferred upon her, hitherto conferred on only one woman, Lady Burdett Coutts. Miss Nightingale was able with great difficulty to sign from her bed her initials upon the City's roll of honour, but it is doubtful if she understood what she was being asked to sign. Perhaps it was better so. In the years of her strength she had ever a dread and a misgiving of the world's praises. In the days of her weakness, when power of work in this world had gone from her, she would have regarded such honours, had she understood them, as coming too late. She sought no glory crown, but the opportunity of doing new work. But the prizes of the world may be of real value to others than those who receive them. The signal honour conferred by the Crown upon Miss Nightingale had the effect of calling fresh attention to her work and her example. Not, indeed, that these depended on adventitious aids to remembrance. To some men and women whose years are many, it is fated that they should outlive their fame. It was not so with Miss Nightingale. To her it was given to become in her lifetime a tradition and almost an institution, and the longer she lived, the greater, the more widespread was her fame. Already on her 80th birthday, 1900, Miss Nightingale had been the recipient of congratulations from Queens and Royal Highnesses, from schools and societies, and from nurses and nursing associations in all parts of the world. In the United States, the name of Florence Nightingale was even more widely known and loved than in Great Britain, and already in 1895 the American Ambassador, Mr. Bayard, had begged the honour of an interview in order to tell her how much revered she is in the United States. Perhaps the congratulations which might have pleased Miss Nightingale most, for she loved efficiency and had read the soul of a people, were those which came from the Far East. From Tokyo, on November 28, 1900, the Princess Imperial sent this letter: "The Committee of the Ladies of the Red Cross Society of Japan have the pleasure of presenting to you their hearty congratulation on the occasion of your 80th birthday. That the address reaches you late in time is due to the great distance which separates your land from ours. But far as our country is from yours, the example of your noble efforts, now become historic, has not affected its inhabitants the less, for it is due to the impulse you have given to the humane work of nursing sick and wounded soldiers that the trained nurses of our Society, amounting to more than 1,500 in number, as well as the members of our Committee, are applying themselves with eager zeal to the study and practice necessary for complete efficiency in the hour of need. May your days still be long, that you may see the lasting influence of your work expand by its own virtue more and more in all the lands of the earth." Miss Nightingale had thus not been forgotten when the Sovereign bestowed the Order of Merit, but the public honour set up a fresh cult of her name and work. Among the private congratulations sent to her, there was one which, if she were able to realise it, must have warmed the soldier's heart in her. It was from Lord Roberts: "Allow me to offer you, on behalf of Lady Roberts and myself, sincerest congratulations on the honour the King has been graciously pleased to confer upon you. It is indeed an honour conferred upon the Order of Merit, all the members of which must feel proud to have the name of Florence Nightingale added to the list." The German Emperor, a little later, had a kindly thought. He had been staying in the New Forest. "His Majesty," wrote the German ambassador, December 10, "having just brought to a close a most enjoyable stay in the beautiful neighbourhood of your old home near Romsey, has commanded me to present you with some flowers as a token of his esteem." The mayor of her native city, Florence, sent congratulations. The Patriotic Society of Bologna made her a companion of honour. From all parts of Great Britain, from the Dominions, from the United States, messages poured in. It was the story of the popular heroine, repeated after 50 years. The beggars and autograph hunters were insistent, the poetasters industrious. A great tribe of Florences, named after the heroine of the Crimea, sent messages. Flowers, needlework, illuminated cards were offered. Companies of Girl Scouts called themselves the Nightingales. There were Florence Nightingale societies in America. Birthday letters to Florence Nightingale became a favourite school exercise. There were Crimean veterans who sent flowers or messages recalling stirring times in which they had served with her, or who in old age and suffering desired to let Miss Florence Nightingale know that they held her in lively and grateful remembrance. In June 1907 there was an international conference of Red Cross societies in London. Queen Alexandra sent a message referring to the pioneer of the first Red Cross movement, Miss Florence Nightingale, whose heroic efforts on behalf of suffering humanity will be recognized and admired by all ages as long as the world shall last. The conference, on the initiative of the Hungarian delegates, resolved unanimously that the great and incomparable name of Miss Florence Nightingale, whose merits in the field of humanity are never to be forgotten, and who raised the care of the sick to the position of a charitable art, imposes on the 8th International Conference of Red Cross Societies the noble duty of rendering homage to her merits by expressing warmly its high veneration. In May 1910 there was a large gathering in the Carnegie Hall in New York, at which the public orator of America, Mr. Choate, delivered an eulogium testifying to the admiration of the entire American people for Florence Nightingale's great record and noble life. The meeting, assembled in honour of the Jubilee of the Nightingale Training School, was eloquent of the spread of her work, being representative of 1,000 nurse training schools in that country. 7. The subject of these friendly manifestations was already passing beyond reach of the hubbub. Her sight was gone, her understanding had grown more feeble. Her regular medical attendant was now Dr. May Thorne, whose skill and unremitting care did much to alleviate the last bedridden years. Sir Thomas Barlow was called in for consultations periodically. Visitors had now been restricted to 2 or 3 a week. Visits were found tiring, for she could not realize, when the visitors were gone, that they were no longer in the room. Nor did she always remember which of her old friends were still alive. She did not realize that Sir Harry Verney was dead. She would sometimes ask for him, and wonder why he did not come. Besides her own nieces, she still saw sisters from St. Thomas's or other nursing friends, and occasionally was able by a question or two to show interest in what they said. One of the last to see her outside the immediate circle was Miss Pringle, her dear friend, the pearl of an earlier chapter. She was sitting up by the fire in the familiar room, her mind evidently busy with happy thoughts, and once or twice she spoke in a tone of satisfaction. This was in February 1910. She could no longer follow sustained reading, but still liked to hear familiar hymns. A favourite, if one may judge by the frequency with which verses from it appear in her latest written meditations, was, "O Lord, how happy should we be, if we could cast our care on Thee, if we from self could rest." Once the expression of an aspiration, now perhaps of attainment. The end came very peacefully. At the beginning of August 1910 she had some ailment, but there seemed no cause for immediate apprehension. On August 13 she fell asleep at noon and did not wake again. She died at about 2:30 in the afternoon. She had lived 90 years and 3 months. The offer of burial in Westminster Abbey was declined by her relatives. She had left directions that her funeral should be of the simplest possible kind, and that her body should be accompanied to the grave by not more than 2 persons. She was buried beside her father and mother in the churchyard of East Wellow, near her old home in Hampshire. The body was borne to the grave by 6 of her children of the British Army, sergeants drawn from the several regiments of the Guards. Her desire that only 2 persons should follow the coffin could not be fulfilled. The funeral arrangements were kept as private as was possible, but there was a wealth of flowers from people of every kind, age, and degree, and the lane and churchyard were filled with a great crowd of men, women, and children, most of them poorly dressed. The family grave is marked by a 4-sided stone monument. On 2 of the sides are inscriptions composed by Miss Nightingale, recording the burial there of her father and mother. On the 3rd is an inscription in memorial of their elder daughter, Lady Verney, who is buried at Claydon. On the 4th side is a small cross with the letters F.N. and the words "Born 1820, died 1910." The family, as she desired, set up no other memorial. The hymn sung over her grave was Bishop Heber's. She had never tired of quoting it in messages to her nurses and her soldiers, and those who had been about her in the closing years were often thrilled by the fire which she still put into her recital of the lines. The Son of God goes forth to war, a kingly crown to gain. His blood-red banner streams afar. Who follows in his train? End of Old Age, Death, continued, 4, 5, 6, and 7. End of the Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2, by Edward Tyas Cook.